There is a place in the dry plains of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India where the ground hides something that should not have been possible. Beneath the cracked earth, beneath layers of dust accumulated across thousands of years, lie the remains of cities that once housed as many as 5 million people. These were not primitive settlements. These were not crude villages scratched together by wandering tribes. These were planned urban centers, built on a grid system so precise that it would not be matched again for millennia. They had indoor plumbing. They had standardized weights and measures. They had multi-story buildings connected to a centralized drainage system, more advanced than anything found in ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia during the same era. And then, somewhere around 1900 before the Common Era, something happened. The people left. The cities emptied. The great civilization of the Indus Valley, one of the largest and most sophisticated societies the ancient world had ever seen, simply ceased to exist. Not with a dramatic last stand. Not with a final battle recorded in stone. They walked away from everything they had built, and they left almost no explanation behind. Think about that for a moment. We are not talking about a small community. We are not talking about one town, or even a handful of villages. At its height, the Indus Valley civilization, also called the Harappan civilization after its first discovered city, stretched across an area of approximately 1.3 million square kilometers. That is larger than the combined territories of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia together. It contained over 1,400 known settlements, including 5 major urban centers, each one a marvel of engineering and civic planning. The city of Mohenjo-Daro alone is estimated to have held between 30,000 and 50,000 residents. Harappa, the other great city, was of comparable size. These cities were connected by trade routes that reached as far as the Persian Gulf, the coast of Oman, and possibly even the shores of eastern Africa. They were part of a sophisticated network of commerce, agriculture, and cultural exchange that sustained itself for roughly 700 years. And then it all stopped. The granaries emptied, the bathhouses dried up, the streets that once echoed with the sounds of daily commerce fell into silence. The jungle and the desert, depending on the region, reclaimed what humans had spent centuries building. What happened to these people? Where did they go? Why did they leave cities that were, by the standards of their era, among the most livable places on the face of the earth? These are not idle questions. These are among the most important unsolved puzzles in the entire field of archaeology, because the Indus Valley civilization did not just vanish. It was erased from human memory for nearly 4,000 years. Unlike Egypt, which left behind pyramids towering above the sand, and unlike Mesopotamia, which left behind libraries of clay tablets, the Indus people left behind almost nothing that we can read. They had a writing system. We have found thousands of inscribed seals, but we have never been able to decipher their script. The Indus script remains one of the great undercoded languages of the ancient world, and without the ability to read their words, we are left to guess. We are left to sift through bricks and bones and broken pottery, searching for clues to a catastrophe that we cannot yet name. What we do know is this: the collapse was not instant, but it was total. Over the span of roughly 200 years, the great cities were abandoned. The sophisticated urban planning disappeared. The standardized systems of measurement broke down. People moved eastward, toward the Ganges Plain, or scattered into smaller rural settlements. Within a few generations, the skills that had built Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were lost. The art of brick-making declined. The complex hydraulic engineering was forgotten. A civilization that had thrived for 7 centuries dissolved like morning fog over the Indus River, and for thousands of years, no one even knew it had existed. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand what archaeologists, climate scientists, and historians believe happened to the Indus Valley people. You are going to see how a convergence of environmental pressures, shifting rivers, changing monsoon patterns, and possibly social upheaval combined to unravel one of the greatest civilizations in human history. You are going to learn why this story matters now, not just as a curiosity of the ancient past, but as a warning that resonates across every century since. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. The Indus Valley civilization was not a footnote in human history. It was one of the main chapters, and the fact that it was forgotten so completely, so thoroughly, that the modern world did not even learn of its existence until the 1820s, tells us something deeply unsettling about the fragility of human memory. We build, we plan, we organize and record and trade and grow, and then something shifts, something breaks, and within a few generations, it is as if none of it ever happened at all. A society that sustained millions, that built cities rivaling anything in the ancient world, that traded with civilizations thousands of kilometers away, vanished so completely that the very bricks of its buildings were ground up for railway ballast before anyone realized what they were. The ground beneath our feet holds stories we have not yet heard. The Indus Valley is one of them, and it is a story that, once you hear it, changes the way you think about everything we have built since. Now, let's begin. To understand what happened to the Indus Valley civilization, we first need to understand what it was. And to understand what it was, we need to place it properly in time and in context, against the backdrop of the other great civilizations of the ancient world. Because only when we grasp the true scale of what was built along the banks of the Indus can we begin to appreciate the magnitude of what was lost. According to current archaeological models, the roots of the Indus Valley civilization stretch back to approximately 3300 before the Common Era. This is the period scholars call the early Harappan phase, when small farming communities along the Indus River and its tributaries began to grow in size and complexity. Villages became towns. Towns developed craft specializations. Regional trade network began to form. By around 2600 before the Common Era, these scattered communities had coalesced into something far more organized, something unprecedented in that part of the world. This was the beginning of the mature Harappan phase, the golden age of the civilization, which lasted until roughly 1900 before the Common Era. That gives us approximately 700 years of sustained urban life, 700 years of building, trading, governing, and thriving at a level of sophistication that the ancient world had rarely seen. To put that in perspective, consider this. 700 years ago from our current time, the world was in the early 1300s. The Black Death had not yet swept through Europe. The Ottoman Empire was in its infancy. The great cathedrals of France were still being constructed. If a civilization had begun at that point and survived until today, it would have witnessed the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Age of Exploration, the Industrial Revolution, 2 world wars, and the digital age. That is the span of time we are talking about. The Indus Valley civilization endured for a period equivalent to the entire modern era of Western history. Think about how much has changed in the past 700 years. Think about the revolutions, the discoveries, the upheavals. The Indus Valley people lived through a comparable span of history, building and maintaining a coherent civilization throughout. And yet today, most people have never heard of them. Now consider the scale. During its mature phase, the Indus Valley civilization occupied an area of approximately 1.3 million square kilometers. To understand what that means, compare it to its contemporaries. Ancient Egypt's civilization was concentrated along the Nile Valley and Delta, a strip of fertile land extending roughly 1,000 kilometers from north to south, but rarely more than 20 kilometers wide. The total area of ancient Egypt's core territory was roughly 34,000 square kilometers. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the cradle of Sumerian and Akkadian civilization, covered an area of roughly 120,000 square kilometers. The Indus Valley civilization, at 1.3 million square kilometers, was approximately 10 times the size of Mesopotamia, and nearly 40 times the size of the core Egyptian territory. It was, by a considerable margin, the largest of the 3 great early civilizations, both in geographical extent and in estimated population. That size comparison deserves to be stated again, in different terms. If you could walk from the northernmost Harappan settlement to the southernmost, at a pace of 30 kilometers per day, it would take you roughly 40 days. If you walked from east to west, from the settlements in what is now western Uttar Pradesh to the coastal sites on the Arabian Sea, it would take you roughly 35 days. This was not a city-state. This was not a small kingdom clustered around a single river valley. This was a subcontinental civilization, spread across mountains, deserts, river plains, and coastlines, unified by shared cultural practices, shared building standards, and shared systems of measurement. Population estimates for the Indus Valley civilization during its peak range from 1 million to 5 million people, depending on the methodology used. The most commonly cited figure among archaeologists today is around 5 million, though some scholars argue for a more conservative estimate of 2 to 3 million. Even at the lower end of this range, this represents a massive population for the Bronze Age. To sustain that many people, the Indus Valley society had to develop agricultural techniques capable of feeding dense urban populations, while also producing surpluses large enough to support non-agricultural specialists. They cultivated wheat, barley, peas, sesame, dates, and cotton. They raised cattle, water buffalo, sheep, and goats. They were among the earliest known cultivators of cotton in the world, spinning and weaving cotton textiles that would become one of their most important trade goods. Their agricultural practices were so effective that the surpluses they generated supported a specialized class of artisans, traders, administrators, and what appear to have been ritual specialists. The numbers are striking when we scale them to human lifetimes. If we estimate a generation as roughly 25 years, then the mature Harappan period lasted for approximately 28 generations. 28 generations of people who were born, lived, worked and died within the framework of a single, continuous civilization. 28 generations of accumulated knowledge, passed from parent to child, from master to apprentice, from elder to youth. When the civilization finally collapsed, all of that accumulated wisdom, 7 centuries of refinement and improvement and adaptation, was dispersed and eventually lost. The knowledge that the 28th generation had inherited from the first, the engineering principles, the civic traditions, the agricultural techniques, the trade protocols, all of it dissolved within a few more generations. What took 700 years to build took perhaps 200 years to lose. The discovery of the Indus Valley civilization is itself a remarkable story, and one that reveals how thoroughly the civilization had been forgotten. The first hints came in 1826, when a British army deserter named Charles Masson stumbled upon the ruins of Harappa while travelling through the Punjab region of what was then British India. Masson, whose real name was James Lewis, was a complicated figure, a former soldier who had deserted the East India Company's army and was travelling under an assumed name. He described the ruins of a vast fortified city, noting the extensive brick walls and the mounds of debris that covered the site. But he did not understand the true age or significance of what he had found. For decades, the site was treated as little more than a curiosity. Local people had been quarrying the ancient bricks for construction for generations. When engineers building the Lahore Molten Railway line in the 1850s needed ballast for the trackbed, they used bricks from Harappa. Thousands of years of architectural achievement were being ground up for railroad gravel. No one realized what they were destroying. It was not until 1856 that Alexander Cunningham, a British Army officer and antiquarian, who would later become the first Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, visited the site and recognized its potential importance. Cunningham conducted limited excavations and recovered several artifacts, including one of the distinctive Harappan stamp seals. But even Cunningham did not grasp the true age of the ruins. He believed they dated to a period much more recent than they actually were. He had no framework for understanding what he had found, because no one at that time imagined that such a sophisticated civilization could have existed in the Indus Valley thousands of years before the Common Era. The prevailing assumption among European scholars was that Indian civilization was relatively young, derived from Greek influence following Alexander the Great's invasion in 326 before the Common Era. The idea that India had possessed a sophisticated urban civilization contemporary with, or even older than, the great civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia was simply not part of the scholarly imagination. The real breakthrough came in 1921 and 1922. In 1921, Dayaram Sahni, an Indian archaeologist working under the direction of Sir John Marshall, the Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, began systematic excavations at Harappa. 1 year later, in 1922, Rakal Das Banerjee, another Indian archaeologist, discovered Mohenjo-Daro, roughly 600 kilometers to the south, in the Sindh province of what is now Pakistan. Banerjee initially believed he had found a Buddhist stupa, a type of religious monument dating to the early centuries of the Common Era. But as excavations progressed, it became clear that the ruins beneath the stupa were far older and far more extensive than anyone had imagined. It was Marshall who first recognized that these two sites, separated by hundreds of kilometers, were part of a single, unified civilization. In September of 1924, Marshall published a notice in the Illustrated London News announcing the discovery of a previously unknown civilization in the Indus Valley. The announcement was a sensation. Overnight, the history of the ancient world had been rewritten. There were not two great cradles of early civilization. There were three. What the excavations revealed was extraordinary and unlike anything found in Egypt or Mesopotamia. Mohenjo-Daro, the name means Mound of the Dead in Sindhi, was a city built on a precise grid plan, with streets running in straight lines from north to south and east to west. The main streets were approximately 10 meters wide, broad enough for 2 ox carts to pass each other with room to spare. Narrower lanes branched off the main streets, providing access to individual residences and workshops. The city was divided into 2 distinct sections. On the western side stood a raised citadel, a fortified platform built on a massive mud brick foundation that rose roughly 12 meters above the surrounding plain. The citadel housed what appear to have been public buildings, including the Great Bath and a large structure that archaeologists have called the granary, though its actual function is debated. On the eastern side lay the lower city, a dense residential area of multi-story brick houses, workshops, marketplaces, and commercial buildings. The precision of the construction was astonishing and remains one of the most distinctive features of Harappan culture. The bricks used throughout the city were of a standardized size, with a consistent ratio of length to width to height of 4 to 2 to 1. This exact ratio was maintained not just in Mohenjo-Daro, but across every major Harappan settlement, from Harappa in the Punjab to Lothal on the coast of Gujarat, over 700 kilometers to the southeast. Think carefully about what this implies. A standardized brick size, maintained across an area larger than most modern European nations, requires a centralized system of measurement, a coordinated supply chain involving thousands of brick makers, and some form of governing authority capable of enforcing construction standards across vast distances. It requires communication. It requires oversight. It requires a shared commitment to uniformity that must have been deeply embedded in the culture. No other civilization of that era achieved anything comparable. Egyptian construction used a variety of stone types and brick sizes. Mesopotamian cities each had their own building traditions. Only the Indus Valley maintained this remarkable uniformity, but it was the drainage system that truly set the Indus Valley apart from every other civilization of the ancient world. Nearly every house in Mohenjo-Daro had its own private bathing area and toilet. These were not luxuries reserved for the wealthy. They appear to have been standard features of ordinary homes. Wastewater flowed from individual homes through clay pipes into covered drains that ran beneath the streets. These street drains were built of carefully fitted bricks, lined with a smooth inner surface to facilitate water flow and covered with removable stone slabs so that they could be inspected and cleaned. At regular intervals, sump pits or cesspools collected sediment, preventing blockages in the main drainage lines. The entire system was gravity-fed, designed with careful attention to slope and flow rate, so that wastewater moved steadily from individual homes to the street drains, and from the street drains to larger channels that carried it away from the inhabited areas. This was, without exaggeration, the most advanced urban sanitation system in the ancient world. There is nothing comparable in contemporary Egypt. There is nothing comparable in Mesopotamia. The Romans, celebrated for their aqueducts and sewers, would not achieve a similar level of urban sanitation for another 2,000 years. And even the Roman system was primarily designed to serve public buildings and wealthy homes. The Harappan system served everyone, every household, every street. The democratic character of this infrastructure suggests a society that placed an extraordinarily high value on public health and civic welfare, a society in which the well-being of ordinary people was a matter of collective concern. The centerpiece of Mohenjo-Daro's public architecture was the Great Bath, a large rectangular pool measuring approximately 12 meters long, 7 meters wide, and 2.4 meters deep. The pool was constructed of finely fitted bricks, sealed with a thick layer of natural tar, or bitumen, to make it completely waterproof. The floor was slightly tilted toward one corner, where a drain allowed the pool to be emptied and cleaned. Steps at either end provided access into the water. Surrounding the pool were a series of small rooms, possibly changing rooms, private bathing chambers, or rooms for ritual preparation. A well located nearby provided fresh water to fill the pool. The purpose of the Great Bath remains one of the enduring debates in Indus Valley studies. Some scholars, following the interpretation first proposed by Marshall himself, believe it served a ritual or religious function, a place for ceremonial purification, similar to the ritual bathing practices still found in South Asian religious traditions today. Others argue it was more utilitarian, a public bathing facility serving the community's hygiene needs. Still others suggest it may have served both functions simultaneously, that in Harappan culture, physical cleanliness and spiritual purity may have been understood as aspects of the same practice. Whatever its purpose, the Great Bath's construction demonstrates a level of engineering sophistication, particularly in waterproofing and hydraulic management, that was unmatched in the ancient world at that time. Trade was the lifeblood of the Indus Valley economy, and the evidence for long-distance commerce is abundant and compelling. Harappan merchants traded with Mesopotamia, with the civilizations of the Persian Gulf, with communities in Central Asia, and with settlements throughout the Indian subcontinent. We know this because Harappan artifacts, particularly the distinctive stamp seals, have been found at archaeological sites throughout the Near East. The seals are small, typically between 2 and 4 centimeters on a side, and are carved from steatite, a soft stone also known as soapstone. Each seal bears a carved image, most commonly a unicorn-like animal, a bull, an elephant, or a rhinoceros, along with a short inscription in the undeciphered Indus script. The seals appear to have been used to stamp impressions in clay, probably to seal packages of trade goods or to authenticate documents. Harappan seals have been found at at Kish, at Tel Asmar, and at other Mesopotamian sites. Mesopotamian cylinder seals and other artifacts have been found at Harappan sites. The Mesopotamians referred to a distant trading partner they called Meluha, described in Sumerian texts as a land of exotic goods including carnelian, timber, and ivory. Most scholars now believe that Meluha was the Indus Valley civilization, or at least the Indus Valley region. The goods traded included cotton textiles, which were unknown in Mesopotamia at the time, carnelian beads of exceptional quality, ivory, timber, and possibly tin and copper. In return, the Harappans likely received silver, wool, leather goods, and other materials that were scarce in the Indus region. At the coastal settlement of Lothal, in present-day Gujarat, archaeologists discovered what appears to be an ancient dockyard, a large rectangular basin measuring approximately 219 meters long and 37 meters wide, connected to an ancient river channel by a narrow inlet. If this interpretation is correct, and it remains debated among scholars, then Lothal was one of the earliest known port facilities in the world. Ships would have entered the dockyard through a sluice gate, designed to maintain water levels during tidal changes, allowing vessels to be loaded and unloaded, regardless of the state of the tide. The engineering required for such a facility speaks to a civilization deeply engaged in maritime trade and possessed of sophisticated knowledge of tidal patterns and hydraulic engineering. The weight system deserves special mention because it reveals something fundamental about Harappan society. Archaeologists have recovered hundreds of small stone cubes, precisely cut and polished, from Harappan sites across the entire civilization. These weights follow a binary progression in the lower ranges, doubling from 1 unit to 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and 64, and then shift to a decimal progression in the higher ranges. The base unit is approximately 0.87 grams, though the exact value is debated. What is not debated is the precision. The weights are accurate to within a fraction of a percent. A Harappan merchant in Lothal, on the coast of Gujarat, could use the same set of weights as a merchant in Harappa, more than 700 kilometers to the north, and both would measure the same quantity of goods to the same degree of accuracy. This level of standardization across such a vast area implies not just a shared system of measurement, but a shared commitment to fairness in trade. It implies an authority that maintained and enforced standards. It implies trust, a civilization-wide trust that the weights were honest, and that transactions could be conducted with confidence. This trust may have been the invisible mortar that held the Harappan world together. Not the force of armies, not the power of kings, but the shared agreement that certain standards would be maintained, that the bricks would be the right size, that the weights would be accurate, that the drains would be cleaned, that the streets would be maintained. It was a civilization built on civic agreement, and when that agreement began to dissolve, so did everything that depended upon it. The sheer diversity of Harappan craftsmanship also speaks to a society of remarkable sophistication. Harappan artisans produced some of the finest beadwork in the ancient world, using materials including carnelian, agate, jasper, lapis lazuli, turquoise, and gold. The long barrel-shaped carnelian beads found at Harappan sites are masterpieces of lapidary art, requiring hours of patient drilling with slender bronze or copper drills. These beads were highly prized across the ancient Near East and have been found in Mesopotamian royal tombs. Harappan potters produced a distinctive painted ware, typically black on red, decorated with geometric patterns, fish, peacocks, and other motifs. Harappan metalworkers were skilled in bronze casting, producing tools, weapons, figurines, and ornaments. The famous dancing girl figurine from Mohenjo-Daro, a small bronze statuette of a young woman standing in a confident, almost defiant pose, is one of the masterpieces of ancient art. It is roughly 4,500 years old, and it radiates a vitality and individuality that transcends the millennia. There are also the mysterious terracotta figurines, found in abundance at Harappan sites, many of them depicting women adorned with elaborate headdresses and jewellery. These have been variously interpreted as representations of a mother goddess, as children's toys, as votive offerings, or as elements of household ritual. Their exact purpose remains unknown, but their sheer abundance suggests they were an important part of daily life in Harappan communities. All of this, the bricks, the drains, the weights, the seals, the beads, the figurines, the great bath, the dockyard at Lothal, all of this speaks to a civilization that had achieved something rare and precious, a way of life that was both materially sophisticated and, as far as we can tell, largely peaceful. The archaeological record contains no depictions of warfare, no great fortifications designed to repel invaders, no mass graves of battle casualties, no weapons caches. The walls that surround Harappan cities appear to have been designed primarily for flood control rather than military defense. This apparent absence of militarism has led some scholars to suggest that the Indus Valley civilization was one of the most peaceful, complex societies in the ancient world. If true, this makes its eventual collapse all the more poignant. A civilization that chose cooperation over conflict, civic welfare over military glory, was still not immune to the forces that bring down all human endeavours. But for all its achievements, the Indus Valley civilization presents us with a paradox that has haunted and frustrated archaeologists for a century. We cannot read their words. The Indus script, found on thousands of seals, tablets, pottery fragments, and copper plates, has never been deciphered. It consists of somewhere between 400 and 600 distinct symbols, depending on how variants are counted and categorized. The average inscription is extremely short, typically fewer than 5 symbols. The longest known inscription contains only 26 symbols. This brevity makes decipherment extraordinarily difficult. There is simply not enough text to identify the patterns of repetition and variation that are necessary to crack an unknown script. Jean-François Champollion cracked Egyptian hieroglyphics in 1822 using the Rosetta Stone, which contained the same text in 3 scripts, including Greek. Michael Ventris deciphered Linear B in 1952 by exploiting patterns in long, repetitive administrative texts. No comparable key exists for the Indus script. No bilingual inscription has been found. No long texts have been recovered. We do not even know for certain whether the symbols represent a fully developed writing system or a more limited system of signs used for specific purposes like trade or ritual. Without the ability to read their script, we cannot know what the Indus people called themselves. We cannot know their myths, their laws, their histories, their prayers. We cannot know whether they had kings or councils, whether they worshipped one god or many, whether they told stories of creation or recorded the deeds of their ancestors. Every interpretation of Indus Valley society must be inferred from physical evidence alone, from bricks and bones, from pottery and plumbing, from the silent testimony of objects that can tell us what was built but not what was thought. This matters enormously when we try to understand the collapse, because unlike Egypt, which left behind papyrus scrolls documenting droughts, famines, and administrative breakdowns, and unlike Mesopotamia, which left behind clay tablets recording wars, conquests, and the pleas of starving populations, the Indus Valley left behind only the physical traces of its own unravelling. We can see that cities were abandoned. We can see that construction quality declined. We can see that populations shifted. But we cannot read a single account written by someone who lived through it. We are archaeologists standing at the scene of a 4,000-year-old disappearance, with abundant physical evidence but no witnesses, no confessions, and no written record of what went wrong. Compare this situation to what we know about the decline of other ancient civilizations. When the Egyptian Old Kingdom collapsed around 2150 before the Common Era, we have texts describing the chaos. A document known as the Admonitions of Ipuwer describes social upheaval, famine, and the breakdown of order. When the Neo-Assyrian Empire fell in 612 before the Common Era, Babylonian chronicles recorded the sieges and the battles. When Rome declined, historians both Roman and foreign documented the process in excruciating detail. But for the Indus Valley, we have nothing. No lament, no chronicle, no account of what went wrong. Just the mute evidence of empty cities and decaying infrastructure. The silence is total, and total silence, when it surrounds an event of such magnitude, is its own kind of mystery. Some scholars have suggested that the Indus script was never intended to record the kind of long narrative texts that would have preserved such accounts. It may have been used primarily for economic or administrative purposes, for labeling goods, for recording transactions, for identifying ownership. If so, then the absence of historical narrative is not surprising. It simply means the Harappans did not have a tradition of written history. They may have preserved their stories orally, passed down through generations in spoken words, that were eventually forgotten when the communities that sustained them dispersed. Oral traditions are fragile. They last only as long as the communities that carry them. And when a civilization disperses, its spoken memories disperse with it, scattered like seeds on barren ground. And it is precisely this silence that makes the question so haunting. What drove the Indus Valley people to abandon their cities? What could have caused a civilization of millions, a civilization that had endured for 7 centuries, to simply walk away from some of the most sophisticated urban environments the ancient world had ever produced? The answer, as we are about to see, is more complex and more troubling than any single catastrophe could explain. It is a story of rivers that changed course, of rains that stopped falling, of a landscape that slowly, quietly turned against the people who had built their entire world upon it. But what scientists discovered next was worse than anyone expected. The central mystery of the Indus Valley collapse can be stated simply. A civilization that showed no signs of external invasion, no evidence of epidemic disease, no indication of sudden catastrophic warfare, disintegrated over a period of roughly 200 years. Between approximately 1900 and 1700 before the Common Era, the great cities were systematically abandoned. The question is why? And the search for an answer has taken archaeologists, geologists, climate scientists, and historians on a journey that has reshaped our understanding of how civilizations die. For much of the 20th century, the dominant theory was invasion. In 1947, the British archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler proposed that the Indus Valley civilizations had been destroyed by invading Aryan tribes sweeping down from Central Asia. Wheeler was a formidable figure in the world of archaeology, charismatic and influential, and his theory carried enormous weight. He pointed to a group of skeletons found scattered in the upper levels of Mohenjo-Daro as evidence of a violent end. He described scenes of massacre, of people cut down in the streets as they fled from conquerors armed with superior weapons. Wheeler connected this to the Rig Veda, one of the oldest texts in the Sanskrit tradition, which describes a god named Indra as a destroyer of forts and a conqueror of dark-skinned enemies. The theory was dramatic, it was compelling, it fit neatly with the prevailing understanding of Indo-Aryan migration. The idea that speakers of early Indo-European languages had migrated into the Indian subcontinent around 1500 before the Common Era, bringing with them the Vedic culture that would eventually give rise to Hinduism. Wheeler seemed to have found archaeological evidence for a historical event described in ancient texts. The Indus Valley civilization, in this reading, was the victim of a violent conquest that inaugurated a new era in South Asian history. But the invasion theory had problems from the start, and those problems became increasingly apparent as more evidence accumulated. The skeletons Wheeler cited as evidence of massacre were found in different archaeological layers at Mohenjo-Daro, meaning they did not all die at the same time. Some of the skeletons showed signs of disease and malnutrition rather than violence. The positioning of the bodies was inconsistent with the idea of a sudden massacre. There was no evidence of burned buildings. There were no destroyed fortifications, no breached walls, no layers of ash that would indicate a military assault. There were no weapons caches left behind by conquerors. There were no mass graves of warriors. The cities showed signs of gradual decline, not sudden destruction. People were leaving slowly, over generations, not fleeing in panic from an approaching army. By the 1960s and 70s, the invasion theory was losing support among archaeologists. George Dales, an American archaeologist who re-examined the skeletal evidence from Mohenjo-Daro in 1964, published a devastating critique titled The Mythical Massacre at Mohenjo-Daro. Dales argued convincingly that the bones told a story of slow death, not sudden violence. The skeletons were scattered across multiple periods of occupation. Some had been buried in ways that suggested deliberate interment, not hasty disposal after a battle. The so-called massacre was, in Dales's assessment, a product of wishful interpretation, a dramatic narrative imposed on ambiguous evidence by an archaeologist who wanted a dramatic story to tell. More recent evidence has further undermined the invasion theory. Genetic studies using ancient DNA from Harappan skeletal remains, including a major study published in 2019 in the journal Science, found no evidence of the kind of abrupt population replacement that a violent invasion would produce. The movement of populations between Central and South Asia was gradual, spanning centuries, a slow diffusion rather than a rapid conquest. The Indus Valley people were not slaughtered and replaced. They were absorbed into broader population movements over time. The decline of the invasion theory left a void. If not conquest, then what? What could have caused a civilization of such size, such sophistication, such apparent stability, to simply dissolve? The search for an alternative explanation led archaeologists into an unlikely alliance with an entirely different scientific discipline, climate science. And what they found over the course of several decades' painstaking research was a story far more complex and in many ways far more troubling than any invasion narrative could ever be. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. In the 1970s and 80s, researchers began using satellite imagery to map the ancient river systems of the Indus Valley region. The technology was relatively new at the time, and its application to archaeology was innovative. What the satellite images revealed reshaped the entire debate. The Indus River, which gives the civilization its name, was not the only major waterway in the region during the Harappan period. Alongside it, running roughly parallel through what is now the Thar Desert of Rajasthan and the dry plains of Cholistan in Pakistan, lay the unmistakable traces of another great river system. A wide, dry riverbed snaked across the landscape, visible from space as a distinct band of differently coloured soil and vegetation. This was the Gagahakra, a river system that had once been a major waterway, but had at some point in the distant past dried up and vanished. The identification of the Gagahakra was not entirely new. Some scholars had long suspected that the Sarasvati, a great river described in the Rig Veda as flowing from the mountains to the sea, might correspond to a now dry river in the region. The Rig Veda describes the Sarasvati as best of mothers, best of rivers, best of goddesses, suggesting that at the time of composition it was a major and life-sustaining waterway. Later Vedic texts describe it as diminishing and eventually disappearing. The identification of the Gagahakra with the Vedic Sarasvati remains debated, and the debate carries political and cultural sensitivities that extend well beyond the realm of archaeology. But the physical evidence for a major ancient river system in the region is now incontrovertible. Geomorphological studies have mapped the ancient riverbed for hundreds of kilometers across the landscape. Borehole samples have confirmed the presence of river sediments deep beneath the desert surface. Remote sensing data has revealed the outlines of abandoned floodplains, oxbow lakes, and tributary channels that once supported a lush agricultural landscape in what is now some of the driest terrain in South Asia. What made this discovery transformative for understanding the Indus Valley collapse was the distribution of Harappan settlements along its banks. Survey after survey, conducted over several decades by Indian and Pakistani archaeologists, revealed concentrations of Harappan sites along the Gagahakra that were denser than those along the Indus itself. In some stretches, settlements were spaced just a few kilometers apart, forming almost continuous ribbons of habitation along the ancient riverbanks. In fact, more Harappan sites have been found along the Gagahakra than along the Indus River. This was not a minor tributary. This was not a seasonal stream. This was a major artery of the civilization, possibly even its primary one. Many archaeologists now argue that the civilization would be more accurately called the Indus Gagahakra civilization, or even the Gagahakra civilization, to reflect the true center of population. The implications were staggering. Here was a river that had quite clearly dried up. A river that had once sustained hundreds of settlements across a vast floodplain had, at some point in the past, simply stopped flowing. The riverbed was there, clearly visible in satellite images and confirmed by ground surveys. But the river was gone. If the river had failed, then the agricultural communities that depended on it would have been devastated. Without water for irrigation, without the annual flooding that deposited rich silt on farmlands and replenished the soil's fertility, the food production system that supported the great cities would have collapsed. People would have had no choice but to move, and that is exactly what the settlement pattern shows. A gradual abandonment of sites along the Gagahakra, with populations shifting eastward and southward toward regions where water was still available. But when had the river dried up, and what had caused it? These questions took researchers into the realm of geomorphology, the study of how landscapes change over time, and the answers they found were startling. The Gagahakra, it turned out, had once been fed by major Himalayan tributaries, rivers whose waters originated in the glaciers and snowfields of the high mountains. At some point, these tributaries had changed course. River capture, the process by which one river system diverts the headwaters of another, is a well-documented geological phenomenon, and it appears to have been the fate of the Gagahakra's major feeders. The Sutlej, which once flowed westward into the Gagahakra system, shifted its course and was captured by the Indus River to the west. The Yamuna, which may also have once contributed water to the Gagahakra, shifted eastward toward the Ganges system. The result was catastrophic for the Gagahakra. Deprived of its major sources of perennial water, it went from being a year-round river to a seasonal watercourse dependent on monsoon rains. And then, as monsoon patterns shifted, it stopped flowing altogether. A landmark study, published in 2012 by Liviu Giosan of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and a team of international researchers provided crucial evidence for this scenario. Using geological surveys, satellite data, and analysis of ancient sediments, Giozen's team made an argument that was both illuminating and deeply counterintuitive. They proposed that the Gagahakra had actually lost its Himalayan tributaries long before the mature Harappan period. In other words, the great civilization had grown up along a river that was already in decline. The early Harappans may have been drawn to the Gagahakra precisely because it was a less volatile river than the Indus. A river fed primarily by monsoon rains rather than by unpredictable glacial melt would have been more predictable in its flow patterns, less prone to the devastating floods that periodically inundated the Indus floodplain. It would have been easier to manage, easier to farm alongside, easier to build near. For a developing agricultural society, a gentle, predictable river was preferable to a powerful but dangerous one. But this advantage contained within it the seeds of catastrophe, because a river dependent on monsoon rains is only as reliable as the monsoon itself. As long as the monsoon delivered consistent seasonal rainfall, the Gagahakra would flow, the floodplains would be renewed, the crops would grow, the cities would be fed. But if the monsoon faltered, if the rains weakened or became irregular, then the river would falter too, and everything built along its banks, everything dependent on its waters, would begin to fail. And it gets worse. The monsoon did shift. A growing body of evidence from multiple independent scientific sources points to a significant weakening of the Indian summer monsoon, beginning around approximately 4,200 years ago. This event, sometimes referred to as the 4.2 kilo-year event, was not limited to the Indus Valley. It was a global climatic episode that has left traces in geological records from every continent. The Old Kingdom of Egypt collapsed during this period. The Akkadian Empire of Mesopotamia, which had unified the region's city-states under a single ruler for the first time, fell apart. Drought and famine swept across the Near East, the Mediterranean, and parts of East Asia. And in South Asia, the monsoon rains that had sustained the Gagahakra and irrigated the farmlands of hundreds of Harappan settlements weakened and became increasingly erratic. The evidence for this climatic shift in the Indus Valley region is compelling and comes from multiple independent lines of research. A study by Yama Dixit of the University of Cambridge, published in 2014, analysed oxygen isotope ratios in the shells of freshwater snails recovered from the bed of an ancient lake in Rajasthan called Kotla Dahar. The chemistry behind the analysis is elegant in its simplicity. Oxygen exists in two stable forms, a lighter version and a heavier version. The ratio of these two forms in lake water is sensitive to changes in the balance between rainfall and evaporation. When a lake receives less rainfall, evaporation dominates, and the water becomes enriched in the heavier form of oxygen. Snails living in the lake incorporate the oxygen from the water into their shells as they grow. By measuring the oxygen isotope ratio in successive layers of ancient snail shells, researchers can reconstruct the history of rainfall at the lake's location, stretching back thousands of years. Dixit's analysis showed a clear and unmistakable signal of increased aridity beginning around approximately 4,100 years ago, precisely the period when the mature Harappan cities were entering their decline. A separate line of evidence came from the ocean. Anil Gupta of the Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology and his colleagues studied sediment cores extracted from the floor of the Arabian Sea off the coast of western India. Ocean sediments accumulate slowly, layer by layer, preserving a record of the materials deposited on the seafloor over thousands of years. Among these materials are wind-blown dust particles, carried from the land surface by desert winds and deposited in the ocean. When the land is dry and vegetation is sparse, more dust is carried by the wind and deposited in ocean sediments. When the land is wet and covered with vegetation, less dust reaches the ocean. Gupta's analysis showed a marked increase in wind-blown dust particles during the period corresponding to the Harappan decline, indicating drier conditions and stronger desert winds on the South Asian mainland. The monsoon was weakening, the land was drying, the rains that had sustained a civilization were faltering. Additional evidence has come from fossilized pollen grains preserved in ancient lake sediments. Studies of pollen records from Rajasthan and Gujarat confirm the shift toward drier conditions during the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era as vegetation patterns shifted from lush trees and shrubs to arid grasses and scrub. The convergence of these multiple lines of evidence paints a picture that is both clear and disturbing. The climate of the Indus Valley region underwent a significant shift during the period when the Harappan civilization was at its peak. The monsoon weakened, rainfall decreased. The Gagahakra, already deprived of its Himalayan tributaries, received less and less monsoon rain. The river shrank, the floodplains dried. The agricultural base that had fed millions of people began to contract. But here is the problem. Climate change alone does not explain everything. Other civilizations faced drought and survived. Egypt endured periods of low Nile flooding and eventually recovered, reassembling itself into the Middle Kingdom after a period of fragmentation. Mesopotamian societies adapted to changing water availability by building increasingly sophisticated irrigation systems, digging canals, constructing reservoirs, reorganizing their agricultural practices. Why did the Indus Valley people not adapt? Why did they abandon their cities rather than modifying their agricultural practices, building new water infrastructure, or reorganizing their society to cope with reduced rainfall? Part of the answer may lie in the nature of Indus Valley governance, or rather, in the puzzle of what kind of governance the Indus Valley had. Unlike Egypt, which had a powerful pharaoh capable of commanding labor and resources on a massive scale, and unlike Mesopotamia, where competing city-states were ruled by kings and priests who could conscript armies and mobilize populations for public works, the Indus Valley civilization seems to have had a fundamentally different kind of authority. There are no great palaces in the archaeological record. There are no monumental statues of rulers. There are no depictions of warfare or military conquest. There are no tombs filled with the wealth and regalia of powerful kings. The uniformity of urban planning, the standardized bricks and weights, suggest some form of centralized coordination, but it appears to have been an authority that expressed itself through civic infrastructure and commercial regulation rather than through military power or personal aggrandizement. Some scholars, including the late Gregory Possel, have suggested that the Indus Valley was governed by some form of collective authority, perhaps a council of merchants, a priestly elite, or a system of urban governance based on consensus rather than command. Others have proposed a system of competing mercantile elites who cooperated on matters of mutual interest, such as trade standards and urban planning, without any single ruler holding supreme power. Still others suggest a form of governance so different from anything in the Western or Near Eastern experience that we lack the conceptual categories to describe it accurately. Whatever form it took, this governance structure may have lacked the coercive power needed to mobilize populations for large-scale adaptation projects under crisis conditions. Building new irrigation canals, relocating settlements, reorganizing agricultural production in the face of changing climate conditions requires strong central authority. It requires the ability to compel people to contribute labor, to redirect resources, to make sacrifices for the collective good. A society governed by consensus, by merchant councils, or by religious tradition might have been effective during stable times, but unable to respond quickly or decisively enough when the environment shifted fundamentally against it. The very qualities that made the Indus Valley civilization admirable, its apparent egalitarianism, its civic orientation, its reluctance to concentrate power in the hands of a single ruler, may have been the qualities that left it unable to adapt when adaptation required swift, centralized action. There is another factor that has only recently begun to receive the attention it deserves: the behavior of the Indus River itself. While the Gagahakra was drying up, drawing water away from the eastern settlements, the Indus was doing something equally destructive in the west. It was flooding. Consider what this meant for the trade networks that had connected the Harappan world. Long-distance trade depended on maintained routes, functioning ports, surplus goods for exchange, and stable social order. As the environmental crisis deepened, each of these prerequisites came under pressure. Evidence from Mesopotamian records suggests that trade with Meluhha declined significantly after approximately 2000 before the Common Era. The great trading relationship that had connected two of the world's oldest civilizations was being severed, not by war or politics, but by the slow strangulation of the conditions that had made it possible. And then there is the question of disease. While there is no direct evidence of a devastating epidemic, the conditions of the late Harappan period, overcrowding in failing cities, deteriorating sanitation, contaminated water, and malnutrition from crop failures, would have created an environment ripe for infectious disease. Skeletal evidence from late-phase Mohenjo-Daro includes individuals showing signs of chronic illness and anemia. The population was under severe physiological stress. The same climatic shifts that reduced average monsoon rainfall may have simultaneously increased the intensity of extreme weather events in certain years. The periods of drought interspersed with periods of catastrophic flooding would have been devastating to agriculture and infrastructure alike. There is clear evidence from geological studies that the Indus River experienced periods of severe flooding during the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era. Mohenjo-Daro, built on the Indus floodplain, shows unmistakable evidence of repeated flood damage. The city was rebuilt multiple times, with new construction rising above layers of flood-deposited silt, each rebuilding slightly less careful than the one before. At some point, the cycle of destruction and rebuilding simply became unsustainable. The resources, the labor, the will required to rebuild a major city after yet another devastating flood eventually exceeded what the society could provide. The pattern that emerges is not one of a single catastrophe, but of a slow, grinding double assault. In the east, along the Gagahakra, drought. The river was failing, the fields were drying. The settlements that had depended on monsoon-fed agriculture were losing their water supply. In the west, along the Indus, flooding. The river was becoming more unpredictable, more violent, more destructive. The two pillars on which the civilization rested were both failing, but in opposite ways. The people caught between these two forces had fewer and fewer viable places to live. The great cities located at the intersection of these two river systems were becoming increasingly untenable. Something is wrong with our assumptions about how civilizations respond to environmental stress. We assume that societies adapt. We assume that when conditions change, people change with them, that they innovate, that they find new solutions. And sometimes they do. But the Indus Valley case suggests that adaptation is not guaranteed. When the environmental changes are severe enough, when they affect multiple systems simultaneously, when the governance structures are not designed for crisis management, the rational response may not be adaptation at all. The rational response may be dispersal. The people leave, they go somewhere else, they start over, and that is what appears to have happened. The dispersal was not a chaotic flight. Archaeological evidence suggests it was a gradual, generation-by-generation process of movement and adaptation. Settlements in the Gagahakra region were abandoned first as the river system failed. Populations shifted eastward, toward the upper reaches of the Ganj-Yamuna plain, where monsoon rainfall was still sufficient for agriculture. Settlements also appeared in Gujarat, to the south, where coastal trade may have offered an alternative economic base. The great cities were abandoned last, perhaps sustained for a time by their accumulated wealth and trading networks, but eventually succumbing to the same pressures that had already emptied the countryside around them. The material evidence of this decline is visible in every stratum of the archaeological record. In the later phases of occupation at Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, construction quality drops noticeably. Buildings that were once made of precisely standardized bricks are patched with irregular stones, broken pottery, and recycled materials. The elaborate drainage systems fall into disrepair. Drains that were once covered and maintained lie open and clogged with refuse. Streets that were once kept clean show signs of accumulated garbage. The standardized weight system, once maintained to extraordinary precision across the entire civilization, begins to fragment into regional variations. It is as if the social contract that had held the civilization together for 7 centuries was slowly dissolving, its institutions decaying along with its physical infrastructure. One of the most poignant pieces of evidence comes from Mohenjo-Daro's upper levels. In the final phases of occupation, archaeologists found evidence of squatter settlements within the ruins of once great buildings. People were living in the bones of a city that had already died. They partitioned grand halls into tiny living spaces. They used fallen masonry as building material. They discarded refuse in rooms that had once been carefully maintained. The craft traditions that had defined Harappan culture at its height, the exquisite bead-making, the precise seal carving, the skilled pottery with its distinctive motifs, all declined sharply in quality and variety. What remained was a shadow of what had been, a memory of greatness, fading one generation at a time. The decline was not uniform across the entire civilization. Different regions experienced the collapse at different times. The earliest signs of abandonment appear in the eastern regions, along the Gaga Hakra, where the river's failure was felt first. Sites show progressive thinning of population before complete abandonment. In the Indus floodplain, the pattern suggests chaotic decline with flood damage, followed by inadequate rebuilding. In Gujarat, some sites actually grew during the early stages of decline as displaced populations migrated southward, before eventually contracting as well. The coastal city of Dolavira, with its sophisticated rock-cut reservoirs designed to capture monsoon rainfall, survived longer than most, but eventually even its water storage could not compensate for declining rainfall. The pattern of the decline, spreading from east to west and from inland to coast, following the geography of water stress, provides some of the strongest evidence that environmental factors, rather than invasion or epidemic, were the primary drivers of the collapse. An invasion would have produced a different pattern, spreading from the northwest, the direction of Central Asia, inward. An epidemic would have spread along trade routes and communication networks, following the pattern of human contact rather than the geography of river systems. Only an environmental explanation accounts for the observed pattern of decline, earliest in the regions most dependent on the failing Gaga Hakra, later in the Indus floodplain, and latest in the coastal regions of Gujarat. There is also the question of what happened to the Harappan skill set as the civilization dispersed. Ceramic analysis provides a telling indicator. The distinctive Harappan pottery tradition underwent marked simplification during the late Harappan period. Vessels became cruder, painted decoration became rarer. Regional styles diverged from the once uniform tradition. The transition was gradual, spanning several generations, again, arguing against sudden catastrophe and in favor of slow cultural transformation under environmental pressure. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. The forces that destroyed the Indus Valley civilization, shifting rivers, changing rainfall patterns, environmental degradation, the inability of governance structures to respond to slow-onset crises, are not unique to the ancient past. They are the same forces that shape the fate of human societies today. The Indus Valley is not just a story about what happened thousands of years ago. It is a mirror, and what it reflects back at us across 40 centuries of distance is deeply uncomfortable. We tell ourselves that civilizations collapse because of invasions, because of wars, because of dramatic catastrophes that can be named and dated. We find comfort in those explanations because they imply that collapse is caused by specific identifiable enemies or events, enemies that can be defeated, events that can be prevented. The Indus Valley story offers no such comfort. It tells us that a civilization can be undone by nothing more dramatic than a shift in the weather, a change in the flow of a river, a slow alteration in the patterns of rainfall. It tells us that the mundane forces of environmental change, forces that operate not in days or years, but in decades and centuries, can bring down even the mightiest achievements of human ingenuity. And it tells us that when the environment changes, even the most sophisticated civilization may find itself unable to adapt. The disappearance of the Indus Valley people does not stand alone in history. It belongs to a broader pattern, a recurring theme across the long arc of human civilization, in which complex, sophisticated societies reach a point of apparent stability, and then, over the course of a few generations, collapse entirely. To understand what happened along the banks of the Indus and the Gaga Hakra, we must look beyond those rivers. We must look at the other great vanishings, the other civilizations that rose to remarkable heights, and then abandoned their cities to the jungle, the desert, and the slow erosion of time. Each of these cases offers a different angle on the same fundamental problem. Each illuminates a different aspect of why civilizations fail, and each, in its own way, reinforces the central question that haunts the Indus Valley. How does a society of millions simply walk away from everything it has built? The answers, as we will see, are never simple. They are never satisfying in the way we want them to be. They resist the clean narratives of cause and effect that we prefer. But they are true, or as close to true as our evidence allows, and the truth they reveal is both sobering and instructive. The first case to consider is Göbekli Tepe, in what is now southeastern Turkey, near the Syrian border. Discovered in 1994 by the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, Göbekli Tepe is one of the most startling archaeological sites on Earth, and one of the most disorienting. It consists of massive T-shaped stone pillars, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing as much as 10 metric tons, arranged in circular enclosures and carved with intricate reliefs of animals: foxes, lions, scorpions, vultures, cranes, wild boar, snakes. The craftsmanship is sophisticated. The stone surfaces are smooth and precisely shaped. The animal carvings are detailed and naturalistic. The site dates to approximately 9500 before the Common Era, making it roughly 11,500 years old by current archaeological estimates. That means Göbekli Tepe was built before the invention of pottery, before the domestication of most crops, before the establishment of permanent farming villages. The people who built it were, by conventional understanding, hunter-gatherers, people who lived by hunting wild animals and gathering wild plants, and yet they organized the labor, resources, and engineering knowledge necessary to quarry, transport, carve, and erect stone monuments on a scale that would not be equaled in the region for thousands of years. The construction of Göbekli Tepe required a labor force of hundreds, possibly thousands, of workers who had to be fed, organized, and directed. The stone pillars were quarried from limestone bedrock at distances of up to several hundred meters from the site, and then moved, using only human muscle and simple tools, to their final positions. The logistics alone are staggering. And all of this was accomplished by people who, as far as we know, had no domesticated animals, no wheeled vehicles, no metal tools, and no permanent settlements. The conventional understanding of human social development, which places the emergence of complex social organization after the development of agriculture, cannot easily account for Göbekli Tepe. Something about this site challenges our assumptions about what hunter-gatherer societies were capable of. But here is where the story takes a turn that resonates with the Indus Valley mystery. Around 8000 before the Common Era, give or take a few centuries, the people of Göbekli Tepe deliberately buried the entire site. They filled in the circular enclosures with rubble, soil, and stone. They concealed the carved pillars beneath tons of debris. They did this systematically and thoroughly, over what appears to have been a considerable period of time. Schmidt, who excavated the site until his death in 2014, believed the burial was intentional, a ritualized decommissioning of a sacred space. But we do not know why they buried it. We do not know what prompted the decision. We do not know whether it was a single event or a process that unfolded over generations. The site was so thoroughly buried and concealed that it remained hidden for approximately 10,000 years, until a Kurdish shepherd noticed a strangely shaped stone protruding from a hillside and brought it to the attention of archaeologists. The parallel to the Indus Valley is not exact, but it is suggestive. In both cases, a sophisticated community created something extraordinary and then deliberately walked away from it. In neither case do we have a clear written explanation for the abandonment. In both cases, the abandonment appears to have been intentional, rather than forced by sudden violence. There are no signs of warfare at Göbekli Tepe, no signs of a natural catastrophe, just a decision, made for reasons we cannot recover, to bury the past and move on. Göbekli Tepe raises a disquieting possibility that goes beyond environmental explanations. Perhaps the decision to abandon a great achievement may be something deeply embedded in human social behavior, a pattern that repeats across cultures and across millennia, driven by forces we do not fully understand. The second case takes us across the Atlantic Ocean to the American Southwest and the people known to archaeologists as the Ancestral Puebloans. These were the people who, between roughly 500 and 1300 of the Common Era, built some of the most remarkable structures in pre-Columbian North America. At Chaco Canyon, in what is now New Mexico, they constructed great houses, massive buildings of stone and timber, some containing over 600 rooms. The largest of these, Pueblo Bonito, rose 4 stories high and covered nearly 2 acres of ground. Its walls were constructed of carefully shaped sandstone blocks, fitted together with a precision that astonishes modern observers. Chaco Canyon was the center of a vast network of roads, trade routes, and outlying communities that stretched across the Four Corners region, where the modern states of Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico meet. The Chaco phenomenon, as archaeologists call this network, flourished from roughly 850 to 1150 of the Common Era. The construction was precise and aligned with astronomical observations. Several structures at Chaco Canyon are oriented to mark the solstices and equinoxes. The road network was extensive, with roads up to 9 meters wide, stretching for distances of up to 64 kilometers, far wider than would have been necessary for simple foot traffic. Some scholars believe the roads served a ceremonial purpose, connecting outlying communities to the ritual center at Chaco Canyon. Others argue they facilitated trade and tribute collection. Whatever their purpose, the roads testify to a level of social organization and labor mobilization that was extraordinary for a pre-agricultural society in a semi-arid environment. And then, around 1150, the great houses at Chaco Canyon were abandoned. The roads fell into disuse. The outlying communities that had looked to Chaco as their center dispersed, or shifted their allegiance elsewhere. Some populations moved north to the Mesa Verde region in southwestern Colorado, where they built the famous cliff dwellings that are among the most iconic images of ancient America. Multi-room stone apartments tucked into the natural alcoves of sandstone cliffs, accessible only by narrow handholds and ladders. These cliff dwellings were occupied for barely a century, from roughly 1190 to 1280, before they too were abandoned. By 1300, the entire Four Corners region had been emptied of its settled population. The people did not disappear. They moved south and east, becoming the ancestors of the modern Pueblo peoples, the Hopi, Zuni, and other communities of the American Southwest. But they left behind their great houses, their cliff dwellings, their astronomical alignments, and their road networks, all of it abandoned to the wind and the slow weathering of the desert. What happened? The evidence points to environmental stress of a kind that should by now feel familiar. Tree ring data from ancient timbers at Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde provide an extraordinarily precise record of rainfall and temperature in the region, year by year, stretching back more than 1,000 years. This record tells a story of severe drought in the late 1200s. The so-called Great Drought of 1276 to 1299 was one of the worst dry periods the region had experienced in living memory. Rainfall dropped well below the minimum needed to sustain maize agriculture, the dietary staple of the ancestral Puebloan communities. Springs dried up. Streams that had provided drinking water and irrigation dwindled to nothing. But drought alone is not a sufficient explanation. The ancestral Puebloans had survived earlier droughts. The region has always been semi-arid, and dry periods were a regular feature of the climate. Something else must have changed. Some scholars point to social and political factors. The breakdown of the regional network centered on Chaco, increasing competition between communities for dwindling resources, rising violence and warfare. There is physical evidence for increased violence in the late Puebloan period, including defensive architecture, burned villages, and skeletal remains showing signs of violent death. Others point to environmental degradation. The deforestation of the mesas surrounding Chaco Canyon, which had been stripped of timber for construction and fuel over centuries, leading to soil erosion, loss of groundwater recharge, and reduced agricultural productivity. The environment had been pushed to its limits long before the Great Drought delivered the final blow. The math is striking. Pueblo Bonito alone is estimated to have required approximately 215,000 timber beams for its construction. Those timbers, primarily ponderosa pine and spruce, had to be transported from forests located more than 75 kilometers away, since the immediate vicinity of Chaco Canyon was too arid and its soils too poor to support large trees. The environmental cost of this construction was enormous. Thousands of trees were felled and hauled across the desert on human backs. The forests that had provided this timber were depleted, and the loss of forest cover would have accelerated erosion and reduced the land's ability to retain water. When the Great Drought arrived, the Ancestral Puebloans had already severely degraded the environmental resources they would have needed to weather the crisis. Does this not echo the Indus Valley, a society that builds its prosperity on environmental resources, that pushes those resources to their limits during good times, and then finds itself unable to adapt when conditions change? The specific details differ. The rivers of the Indus are not the droughts of the American Southwest. The bricks of Mohenjo-Daro are not the sandstone blocks of Pueblo Bonito, but the underlying dynamic is the same. Human civilizations are built on environmental foundations, and when those foundations shift, even slightly, the civilizations built upon them can come apart with stunning speed. The third case is one of the most dramatic in the entire archaeological record: the Khmer Empire of Southeast Asia. From the 9th to the 15th century of the Common Era, the Khmer ruled over a vast territory centered on the city of Angkor, in what is now northwestern Cambodia. At its peak, between roughly the 11th and 13th centuries, Angkor was almost certainly the largest city in the world. Modern research using airborne laser scanning, a technology called LiDAR that can see through forest canopy to reveal structures hidden beneath, has shown that Angkor's urban sprawl covered approximately 1,000 square kilometers. That is roughly the size of the modern city of Los Angeles. The population may have reached 750,000 to 1 million people at its peak, a figure that dwarfs any European city of the same period. The Khmer were master hydraulic engineers, and their water management system was one of the most sophisticated in the pre-modern world. They constructed enormous reservoirs called barrays, the largest of which, the West Barray, measures roughly 8 kilometers long by 2.1 kilometers wide, and could hold approximately 53 million cubic meters of water. They built an intricate network of canals, channels, and distribution systems that captured monsoon rainfall, stored it, and distributed it across the agricultural landscape during the dry season. This system sustained intensive rice agriculture on a scale that could feed the enormous population of Greater Angkor. The temple complex of Angkor Wat, built in the early 12th century by King Suryavarman II, is the largest religious monument ever constructed, covering over 160 hectares. Its 5 towers, representing the peaks of Mount Meru, the cosmic mountain of Hindu mythology, rise above a vast complex of galleries, courtyards, and bas-relief sculptures that depict scenes from Hindu mythology and from the Khmer Empire's military campaigns. The construction required millions of sandstone blocks, quarried from mountains more than 50 kilometers away and transported to the site by canal and raft. The engineering achievement is breathtaking, but it was not just a temple. It was a statement of power, a claim to divine authority, a physical manifestation of the Khmer king's role as a bridge between the human and the divine. And yet, by the mid-15th century, Angkor was abandoned. The city that had been the heart of a vast empire was swallowed by the tropical forest. When European explorers encountered the ruins in the mid-19th century, they found temples being dismantled by the roots of enormous strangler fig trees, their carved stone faces staring out from beneath tangles of vines and creepers. The French naturalist Henri Mouhot, who visited Angkor in 1860, wrote that the ruins were grander than anything left by Greece or Rome, and struggled to reconcile the magnificence of the architecture with his era's prejudices about Southeast Asian civilization. What destroyed the Khmer? Research published over the past 2 decades has revealed a story of environmental collapse that parallels the Indus Valley in several key respects. Tree ring records from Vietnam, analysed by Brendan Buckley of the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, show that the region experienced a series of severe droughts interspersed with periods of unusually heavy monsoon rainfall during the 14th and 15th centuries. This pattern of alternating extremes was devastating to the Khmer water management system, which had been designed for average conditions and could not handle either extreme. During droughts, the reservoirs and canals dried up, and the agricultural system that depended on them failed. During periods of heavy rain, the system was overwhelmed, and the canals and reservoirs suffered damage from flooding and erosion. Roland Fletcher of the University of Sydney has argued that the failure of the water management system was the primary cause of Angkor's abandonment. As the infrastructure deteriorated, agricultural production declined. The population could no longer be sustained at its former levels. Meanwhile, the Khmer faced growing military pressure from the Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya to the west, which attacked Angkor multiple times in the 14th and 15th centuries. The final sack of Angkor by Ayutthayan forces in 1431 is traditionally cited as the end of the Khmer Empire, but Fletcher argues that the city had already been in decline for decades before the final military blow. The Thai invasion was the coup de grace, not the primary cause. The real killer was the failure of the water system, and the cause of that failure was climatic variability. Once again, we see the same pattern: a sophisticated society built on hydraulic engineering, environmental changes that stressed the water management system beyond its capacity, the failure of political structures to maintain and adapt the infrastructure, and the eventual abandonment of a city that had thrived for centuries. The parallels with the Indus Valley are almost uncanny. There is a detail about the Khmer collapse that adds another layer of resonance. LiDAR surveys conducted in 2012 revealed that the water management infrastructure was far more extensive than previously imagined, forming an integrated hydraulic system across the entire Angkor region. The system was so interdependent that the failure of any one component cascaded through the entire network. This was a system that worked beautifully when it worked at all, and catastrophically when it did not. The same could be said of the Indus Valley's dependence on the Gagahakra. The Khmer story also illustrates the role of infrastructure maintenance in civilizational survival. Complex hydraulic systems require constant upkeep. When agricultural production declines because of climate stress, the surplus available for maintenance declines with it, leading to further infrastructure degradation, further production decline, and a downward spiral. This is almost certainly what happened in the Indus Valley as well. The fourth case brings us to the heart of North America and a city that most people have never heard of. Cahokia, located near the confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers, just east of present-day St. Louis, Missouri. Cahokia was the largest pre-Columbian settlement north of Mexico. At its peak, around 1050 to 1200 of the Common Era, the city proper housed an estimated 10,000 to 20,000 people, with perhaps another 20,000 to 30,000 living in surrounding communities. The total population of the Cahokia region may have approached 50,000, a figure that makes it comparable to many European cities of the same period. London in the year 1100 had a population of roughly 15,000. Cahokia at the same time was likely 2 to 3 times larger. The city was dominated by Monk's Mound, a massive earthen platform covering over 5.5 hectares at its base and rising roughly 30 meters above the surrounding floodplain. It is the largest earthwork in the Americas and one of the largest in the world. Its construction required the movement of approximately 700,000 cubic meters of earth, carried in baskets by human laborers over a period of several centuries. The mound's summit platform supported a large wooden building, probably the residence of Cahokia's paramount chief. Surrounding Monk's Mound was a grand central plaza, roughly 19 hectares in extent, leveled and surfaced with layers of colored clay. Beyond the plaza lay a complex of smaller mounds, residential neighborhoods, craft workshops, and a sophisticated astronomical observatory made of large wooden posts, known to archaeologists as Woodhenge, which allowed observers to track the solstices and equinoxes. Cahokia's social organization was among the most complex in pre-Columbian North America. The community supported specialized craft workers, including shell bead makers, flint knappers, potters, and copper artisans. It maintained long-distance trade networks that brought marine shell from the Gulf of Mexico, copper from the Great Lakes region, and chert from quarries hundreds of kilometers away. There is evidence of social hierarchy, with elite burials containing elaborate grave goods. The famous Mound 72 burial contained a high-status individual laid on a platform of 20,000 shell beads, accompanied by sacrificial remains. And then, around 1300, Cahokia was abandoned. The population dispersed. The mounds were left to erode. The wooden structures rotted away. By the time European explorers arrived in the region in the 16 and 1700s, no living culture claimed direct connection to the ruins. The builders of Cahokia had vanished from living memory, just as the builders of Mohenjo-Daro had vanished from the memory of the Indian subcontinent. Why did Cahokia fail? Archaeological and environmental research points to a now familiar combination of factors. The city's location on the Mississippi floodplain, which had initially been an advantage because of the rich alluvial soils, became a liability as population grew and environmental pressures mounted. Deforestation of the surrounding uplands, driven by the need for construction timber and fuel, led to increased soil erosion and sedimentation in the floodplain. Increased flooding, possibly linked to climatic shifts during the transition from the medieval warm period to the Little Ice Age, damaged agricultural fields, and may have contaminated water supplies. A major flood around 1150 appears to have caused significant damage to the city, and may have prompted the construction of a large wooden palisade around the central precinct, suggesting increasing social instability and concern about defense. Evidence from pollen records and soil analysis suggests that the Cahokia region experienced a significant increase in flooding frequency and intensity in the 12 and 1300s. At the same time, the upland forests that had been cleared for agriculture and fuel were slow to regenerate, leaving the landscape vulnerable to erosion. The agricultural system that had supported the city's large population was being degraded from both ends. Too much water in the floodplain, too little forest cover on the hillsides. Social stress increased as well. Archaeological evidence from the later phases of Cahokia's occupation includes fortification walls, evidence of fire, and increasing numbers of burials, showing signs of violent death. The picture is one of a society under growing strain, struggling to maintain order and cohesion in the face of environmental and social pressures that exceeded its capacity to manage. The Cahokia story reveals something that resonates with the Indus Valley: the relationship between social structure and civilizational fragility. Cahokia had pronounced social hierarchies, with human sacrifice and concentrated wealth. Some researchers argue this inequality contributed to its decline, as ordinary people abandoned a system that demanded more of them than it returned. This raises a contrast with the apparently egalitarian Indus Valley. If Cahokia failed partly because of inequality, and the Indus Valley failed despite apparent equality, then neither social model provided immunity to collapse. Both systems had strengths and vulnerabilities, and neither was sufficient to prevent abandonment when the environment turned hostile. There is also the question of memory. The descendants of the Ancestral Puebloans retain oral traditions describing their ancestors' migrations and the reasons for them. The Khmer people of Cambodia retained memory of Angkor throughout the centuries. But the Indus Valley people left behind no such memory. Their descendants retained no stories of the great cities, no legends of the departure. The forgetting was complete, suggesting a dispersal so thorough that even the memory of what had been was dissolved. The fifth case involves the most mysterious actors in ancient Mediterranean history, the Sea Peoples. Around 1200 before the Common Era, at the end of the Bronze Age, a confederation of naval raiders swept across the eastern Mediterranean, leaving destruction in their wake. The Hittite Empire, which had dominated Anatolia and northern Syria for centuries, collapsed and never recovered. Mycenaean Greece fell into a dark age that lasted roughly 400 years. Ugarit, a prosperous port city on the Syrian coast that had been a hub of international trade, was destroyed and abandoned. The palace at Pylos, in southwestern Greece, was burned. Troy was sacked. The entire network of Bronze Age civilizations that had connected Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, and the Aegean was torn apart. Egypt survived, but barely. The pharaoh Rameses III fought a series of desperate battles against the Sea Peoples in roughly 1178 before the Common Era, and his victory, recorded in dramatic relief carvings at his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, preserved Egyptian independence, but did not restore the regional order that had been destroyed. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu describe the Sea Peoples in dramatic terms, listing their names. The Pelis, possibly the Philistines who would later settle on the coast of Canaan, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, possibly Sicilians, the Denyen, possibly the Danans of Greek tradition, the Weshesh. But beyond these names, the identity and origins of the Sea Peoples remain deeply uncertain. The deeper question is not who the Sea Peoples were, but what drove them. Why did entire populations uproot themselves and take to the sea, attacking and destroying civilizations that had endured for centuries? Recent research has increasingly pointed to environmental factors. The Late Bronze Age collapse coincided with severe drought across the eastern Mediterranean. Pollen records from lakes in the Levant show a dramatic decline in tree and shrub pollen and a corresponding increase in grass and weed pollen, indicating a shift from forested landscapes to arid grasslands. Letters found in the ruins of Ugarit, written in the city's final days, described desperate pleas for grain from neighbouring rulers. The collapse was preceded by famine. The Late Bronze Age world was a highly interconnected system of trade and diplomacy, in which the economies of Egypt, the Hittites, Mycenae, Cyprus, and the Levantine city-states were deeply intertwined. Bronze itself, the defining material of the age, required both copper and tin, which were found in different regions and had to be traded across long distances. When the climate shifted and agricultural production declined, the trade networks that connected these civilizations came under pressure. When the trade networks failed, the societies that depended on them failed too. The Sea Peoples may not have been the cause of the collapse. They may have been its symptom. Displaced populations, driven from their homelands by drought and famine, turning to raiding and migration as a survival strategy. Eric Klein of George Washington University has argued that the Late Bronze Age catastrophe was a classic example of systems collapse, in which multiple interconnected systems failed simultaneously. Drought reduced agricultural production, famine disrupted trade. Disrupted trade cut off access to tin for bronze making. Without bronze, armies and tools could not be maintained. Without armies, order broke down. The entire system came apart because of the interconnected failure of multiple systems, each of which depended on the others. This concept applies to the Indus Valley with remarkable precision. The Harappan world was also an interconnected system. Remove any one element, agriculture, trade, urban governance, infrastructure maintenance, and the rest begin to falter. Remove two or three simultaneously, and the system enters a cascade of failures that becomes irreversible. There is one more case worth mentioning briefly, because it brings the pattern even closer to the Indus Valley. The city of Mohenjo-Daro itself was not built in a single phase. Excavations have revealed multiple layers of construction, separated by layers of river-deposited silt. This means the city was flooded and rebuilt, multiple times over the course of its history. Each rebuilding was slightly less ambitious than the one before. The walls were a little thinner, the bricks were a little less uniform, the drainage was a little less carefully maintained. It is as if the city was aging, losing vitality, growing tired. The last occupants of Mohenjo-Daro were not the heirs of the city's builders. They were the last residents of a place that had been slowly dying for centuries, people making do with what was left, patching holes in walls that would soon be buried beneath the dust of ages. The pattern is now visible across 5 different civilizations, separated by thousands of years and thousands of kilometers, spanning 3 continents and encompassing societies ranging from hunter-gatherer groups to sprawling urban empires. In each case, a sophisticated society builds its prosperity on a specific environmental foundation. In each case, that foundation is disrupted by forces largely beyond the society's control. In each case, the society's political and social institutions prove unable to manage the crisis effectively. and in each case, the result is abandonment. Cities left empty, knowledge lost, achievements forgotten. But here is where we must return to the Indus Valley and confront what makes its case unique among all these examples of collapse. Unlike the ancestral Puebloans, the Indus people did not face a single great drought. Their crisis was more complex, a simultaneous drying of one river system and destabilization of another. Unlike the Khmer, they left behind no inscriptions describing their rulers, their wars, or their struggles with the elements. Unlike the Sea peoples, they did not turn to violence and raiding. Unlike Cahokia, they do not appear to have experienced significant internal warfare or social upheaval in the later stages of their decline. The Indus Valley civilization seems to have dissolved peacefully, or at least without the dramatic violence that marked the end of other ancient societies. There are no burned cities. There are no mass graves of warriors. There are no defensive fortifications hastily erected in a civilization's final years. There are only empty streets, decaying buildings, and the slow accumulation of dust over abandoned homes. This peacefulness, if that is what it was, is itself one of the most profound mysteries in archaeology. How does a civilization of millions disband without widespread conflict? How do people walk away from their cities without fighting over the resources that remain? How does a society that has maintained shared standards and shared institutions across an area larger than ancient Egypt simply agree to go its separate ways? Some scholars have suggested that the Indus Valley civilization's apparent egalitarianism, its lack of monumental royal architecture and military imagery, may provide a clue. Perhaps a society without strong central authority, without a warrior elite invested in holding territory at all costs, is actually more likely to disperse peacefully when conditions deteriorate. If no one is fighting to maintain power, then no one needs to fight at all. People simply assess their situation, recognize that the old way of life is no longer sustainable, and leave. This interpretation is speculative, and not all scholars accept it. Some argue that we simply have not found the evidence of violence. Others suggest that the apparent egalitarianism of the Indus Valley may be an artifact of our inability to read their script, that palaces and royal tombs may yet be discovered at unexcavated sites. But the interpretation offers a tantalizing possibility. Perhaps the collapse of the Indus Valley was not a failure of civilization, but a choice. Perhaps the people looked at their failing rivers and their changing climate and made a collective, pragmatic, generation-by-generation decision to move on. Perhaps the abandonment of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa was not a catastrophe, but a managed migration, a rational response to environmental change carried out over 2 centuries by a society that valued survival over permanence, that valued people over monuments. There is a strange beauty in this interpretation. The pharaohs built tombs designed to last for eternity. The Khmer emperors constructed Angkor Wat as a bridge between earth and the divine. But the Indus Valley people built for function rather than glory. Their grandest structure was a public bath, not a royal tomb. Their most impressive achievement was a drainage system, not a pyramid. And when the time came to leave, they appear to have left without clinging to monuments that no longer served a purpose. They may have possessed something rarer than monumental architecture, the wisdom to know when to let go. If that is true, then the Indus Valley story is not just a tale of loss. It is also a tale of adaptation, of a kind we rarely celebrate. The people who left the great cities did not disappear. They moved east and south. They settled in new communities along the Ganges, in Gujarat, in the highlands of central India. They continued to farm, to trade, to make pottery and beads and tools. The specific cultural forms of the Harappan civilization were lost, the precise bricks, the standardized weights, the undeciphered script, but the people themselves survived. Their descendants are, according to genetic and archaeological evidence, among the ancestors of the populations that live in South Asia today. The civilization ended, the people did not, and yet there is a cost to this kind of survival. A cost that may not be immediately obvious, but that echoes across all the examples we have examined. When a civilization dissolves, it takes its accumulated knowledge with it. The engineering skills that built Mohenjo-Daro's drainage system were not passed on to the smaller rural communities that replaced the great cities. The standardized measurement systems that had unified an area larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined broke down into fragmented regional variations. The undeciphered script, whatever it recorded, was no longer used. The skill of carving seals was lost. The technique of making long barrel-shaped carnelian beads declined and eventually disappeared. Within a few generations, the memory of the great cities faded, and the Indus Valley civilization slipped beneath the surface of history, not to be rediscovered for nearly 4,000 years. This loss of knowledge is the deepest and most universal consequence of civilizational collapse. It is not the fall of walls or the emptying of streets that matters most. It is the loss of what was known. Skills that took centuries to develop can be lost in a generation if the conditions that require those skills no longer exist. Knowledge that was once common becomes rare, then forgotten, then invisible. And once knowledge is lost in this way, lost not through destruction, but through disuse, it can be extraordinarily difficult to recover. The world became a slightly poorer, slightly less capable place when the last Harappan engineer forgot how to grade a drain, when the last Harappan scribe stopped using the symbols that once recorded commerce and governance, when the last person who could explain why the bricks were made in that precise ratio of 4:2:1 passed on without being asked. And this is where the answer becomes deeply unsettling, because the phenomenon we are describing is not historical. It is ongoing. Knowledge is being lost today, all over the world. Traditional agricultural techniques, traditional building methods, traditional ecological knowledge accumulated over centuries by indigenous and rural communities, all of it is disappearing at a rate that would horrify us if we could measure it accurately. The pattern that destroyed the knowledge of the Indus Valley is the same pattern at work in the modern world. When the conditions that support a body of knowledge change, the knowledge itself is at risk. When people no longer need to know something, they stop learning it. And when they stop learning it, it is gone. Consider the specific knowledge lost with the Indus Valley civilization. The technique of firing bricks to a precise hardness using controlled kiln temperatures. The method of grading drainage channels to achieve the correct flow rate without modern surveying instruments. The art of cutting and polishing carnelian beads to a mirror finish using nothing but copper drills and abrasive sand. The system of weights that maintained accuracy across a subcontinental area. The script itself, whatever it was used for. Each of these represented centuries of accumulated experimentation, trial and error, refinement. Each required not just individual skill, but an institutional framework for training, quality control, and transmission. When the institutions dissolved, the skills they supported dissolved with them. The pattern repeats itself in every case we have examined. The Ancestral Puebloans lost the astronomical knowledge that had aligned the great houses of Chaco Canyon. The Khmer lost the hydraulic engineering that had sustained Angkor's water management system. The people of Cahokia lost the mound-building tradition that had created the largest earthwork in the Americas. In each case, skills and knowledge that had taken generations to develop were lost when the social structures that supported them disappeared. The lesson is clear and troubling. Knowledge is not a possession, it is a practice. It exists only in the doing, and when the conditions that require the doing change, the knowledge is at risk. It can vanish within a single generation, silently, without anyone noticing until it is far too late to recover what was lost. The libraries of the Indus Valley were not burned, they were simply abandoned, and the knowledge they contained, whatever form it took, dissolved into the silence of the empty streets. Then something happened that changed everything. Or rather, something was discovered that transformed our understanding of the entire Indus Valley collapse. And it came not from the ruins of ancient cities, but from the floor of the Arabian Sea and the caves of the Himalayan foothills. In 2018, a research team led by Nick Scroxton, then at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, published a study based on analysis of a stalagmite from Sahia Cave in Uttarakhand in the foothills of the Himalayas. Stalagmites grow by the slow accumulation of mineral deposits from water that drips from cave ceilings. Each layer of mineral deposit contains chemical information about the temperature and rainfall conditions at the time it was formed. The ratio of different oxygen isotopes in each layer is particularly informative. It shifts in response to changes in the source and amount of rainfall. By analyzing oxygen isotope ratios along the length of the stalagmite, layer by layer, Scroxton's team was able to reconstruct a detailed record of monsoon variability in northwestern India, spanning several thousand years, reaching back to the era of the Harappan civilization and beyond. What they found was deeply unsettling and added a new dimension to the story of the Indus Valley collapse. The monsoon did not simply weaken during the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era. It became unpredictable. The year-to-year variability increased dramatically. In some years, the rains were adequate or even abundant. In other years, they failed almost entirely. This is a pattern that climate scientists call increased volatility, and it is, in many ways, more destructive than a straightforward decline in average rainfall. A society can adapt to consistently low rainfall by adjusting its agricultural practices, by planting drought-resistant crops, by reducing the area under cultivation, by shifting to pastoralism, by reducing population density through emigration. These are painful adjustments, but they are manageable because they require only that people adapt to a new, stable set of conditions. But a society cannot easily adapt to a situation where it does not know, from one year to the next, whether the rains will come or not. Agriculture, especially the kind of intensive grain agriculture that sustained the Harappan cities, requires planning. Seeds must be selected months in advance. Fields must be prepared before the planting season. Irrigation channels must be maintained. Labor must be organized. All of this planning depends on reasonable predictions about the coming season's rainfall. If the rains fail after planting, the crop is lost and the seeds are wasted. If the rains come too heavily after a prolonged dry spell, the result is not abundance but erosion, flooding and destruction of the very fields that were meant to be nourished. If the rains are adequate one year and catastrophically absent the next, the farmers who expanded their planting in the good year are devastated in the bad year. Volatility undermines the very basis of agricultural planning. It turns every season into a gamble, every planting into a risk. Let that sink in. The Indus Valley people were not facing a simple drought, they were facing chaos, environmental chaos, a world in which the rhythms they had depended on for 7 centuries, the predictable cycle of monsoon and dry season that had made their entire way of life possible, were breaking down, becoming random, unreliable, impossible to anticipate. Every season became uncertain, every harvest was in doubt, and the cumulative effect of year after year of this uncertainty, of failed harvests interspersed with occasional bumper crops that offered false hope, would have been devastating to a society that lacked modern storage technology, modern transportation networks, or modern communication systems. A bad harvest in one year could be survived by drawing on reserves. 2 bad harvests in succession were a crisis. 3 or more became a catastrophe. And in a climate of increased volatility, sequences of multiple bad years become statistically more likely, even if the average rainfall has not declined by very much. This finding about monsoon volatility connects to another body of research that has been accumulating steadily over the past 2 decades. Studies of sediment cores from the Arabian Sea, the Bay of Bengal, and several inland lakes in Rajasthan and Gujarat have consistently shown the same picture: a progressive drying and a simultaneous increase in climatic variability across South Asia during the period corresponding to the Harappan decline. The monsoon system that had sustained one of the world's great civilizations was, in the language of climate science, reorganizing. It was shifting to a new mode of behavior, one that was drier on average and more variable from year to year. This reorganization was not unique to South Asia. It was part of a global climatic shift that affected civilizations across the ancient world, from Egypt to Mesopotamia to China. But in the Indus Valley, where the entire economy was built on monsoon-fed agriculture and monsoon-fed rivers, the effects were particularly devastating. The implications of this research extend far beyond archaeology. The Indian summer monsoon is one of the largest and most consequential climate systems on Earth. It is driven by the differential heating of the Indian subcontinent and the surrounding ocean, which creates a massive seasonal circulation of air that draws moisture from the Indian Ocean and deposits it as rain across South Asia. This single climate system governs the water supply for agriculture across the entire Indian subcontinent. It determines whether rivers flow or run dry, whether reservoirs fill or empty, whether the harvest succeeds or fails. More than 1 billion people today depend directly on the Indian monsoon for their food and water. The Indus Valley collapse is not just a story about what happened 4,000 years ago. It is a cautionary tale about what can happen when a monsoon system shifts. This is not science fiction. This is the lesson written in the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, inscribed in the dry bed of the Gagahakra, encoded in the chemical layers of stalagmites and the sediments of the Arabian Sea floor. A great civilization, home to millions of people, possessing engineering knowledge that was unsurpassed in the ancient world, was undone not by armies or plague, but by changes in rainfall patterns. By rain, or rather, by the failure of rain and the unpredictability of its coming and going. There is a tendency in human thinking to assume that the systems we depend on are stable, that the conditions we have always known will continue indefinitely, that the climate we grew up with is the climate that will persist. This assumption is so deeply embedded that we rarely examine it. It feels like common sense. The seasons have always turned, the rains have always come, the rivers have always flowed. But the Indus Valley collapse reveals this assumption as an illusion. The seasons do not always turn on schedule, the rains do not always come, rivers change course, climate patterns shift, and when they do, the human systems built on the assumption of stability can collapse with a speed that is shocking. The Harappan people built their civilization on the assumption that the monsoon would continue to deliver rain in roughly the same quantities at roughly the same times, year after year. This was not an unreasonable assumption. The monsoon had been relatively stable for centuries before the mature Harappan period. But the assumption was wrong. The monsoon shifted, and because the entire civilization had been optimized for the old pattern, for the rhythm of reliable seasonal rainfall, there was no flexibility in the system to accommodate the new pattern. The bricks were the right size, the drains were the right slope, the fields were the right width. Everything was perfect for a world that no longer existed. This is the trap of optimization. The more perfectly a system is adapted to specific conditions, the more catastrophically it fails when those conditions change. Engineers call this brittleness. Ecologists call it a loss of resilience. Historians see it again and again in the record of collapsed civilizations. The most successful, most efficient, most perfectly adapted societies are often the ones most vulnerable to sudden change. Their very perfection is their weakness. Let that sink in. There is another dimension to the deeper truth of the Indus Valley collapse that deserves careful attention. The drying of the Gagahakra did not just destroy agriculture, it disrupted the trade networks that had connected the Harappan world to the wider ancient economy. Many of the Harappan settlements along the Gagahakra were involved in specialized craft production and long-distance trade. The distinctive Harappan bead workshops, which produced carnelian, lapis lazuli, agate, and other semi-precious stone beads that were traded across the ancient Near East, were concentrated in regions that depended on the river system for water and transportation. When the river failed, these workshops lost access to the water needed for cutting and polishing processes. They also lost the riverine trade routes that connected them to coastal ports and to the broader Mesopotamian trade network. The beads stopped being made, the trade stopped flowing, and the economic surplus that had supported the entire urban apparatus of Harappan civilization began to contract. The loss of trade would have had cascading effects throughout the civilization. Trade provided the Indus Valley with access to essential raw materials that were not available locally. Tin for bronze making, which came from Central Asia or possibly even as far as Cornwall in Britain, silver for adornment and possibly for trade tokens, lapis lazuli from the mines of Badakhshan in northeastern Afghanistan, conch shells from the Arabian Sea coast. As trade declined, the availability of these materials would have diminished. The specialized craft traditions that depended on imported raw materials would have withered. The workshops that had employed skilled artisans would have closed, and the economic surplus that had allowed cities like Mohenjo-Daro to sustain large populations of non-farming specialists, the administrators, the craft workers, the merchants, the ritual specialists, would have shrunk, forcing more and more people back into subsistence agriculture. This economic contraction would have further weakened the social institutions that held the civilization together. If the standardized weight system was maintained by a merchant class engaged in long-distance trade, then the decline of trade would have undercut the authority and relevance of that class. If the elaborate drainage systems were maintained by a civic administration funded by agricultural surpluses and trade profits, then the decline of both agriculture and trade would have starved that administration of the resources it needed to function. The institutions that had built and maintained the civilization's infrastructure would have found themselves unable to keep up with the demands of maintenance, repair, and adaptation precisely at the moment when those demands were greatest. The result was a feedback loop of decline, a vicious cycle in which each consequence of the environmental crisis made the next consequence worse. Environmental stress reduced agricultural production and disrupted trade. Reduced production and trade weakened the economic base that supported urban institutions. Weakened institutions were unable to maintain infrastructure or coordinate adaptive responses. Failing infrastructure further reduced productivity and disrupted trade, and so the cycle continued, each turn making recovery more difficult, each year bringing the civilization closer to a threshold of collapse from which there was no return. This is the deeper truth about civilizational collapse. It is rarely caused by a single factor. It is almost never the result of a single dramatic event, a single invasion, a single drought, a single flood. It is the product of multiple stresses, acting simultaneously, reinforcing each other, creating a cascade of failures that overwhelms the capacity of human institutions to respond. The Indus Valley civilization did not collapse because of drought alone, or because of river shifts alone, or because of trade disruption alone, or because of institutional weakness alone. It collapsed because all of these things happened at the same time, and the compound crisis they created exceeded the capacity of the society's governance structures to manage. There is an additional element to this feedback loop that is often overlooked: the psychological dimension. When systems fail gradually, the people living within them do not always recognize what is happening. Each generation inherits a world slightly worse than the one their parents knew, but since they have no direct memory of the better times, the decline seems normal. This phenomenon, known as shifting baseline syndrome, was first described in the context of fishery science, where each generation of fishers accepts the depleted fish stocks of their own time as the baseline, not realizing how much richer the sea was before. The same principle almost certainly operated in the Indus Valley. The generation that saw the Gagahakra reduced to a seasonal trickle had no memory of the time when it had been a great perennial river. The generation that lived among the decaying drains of Mohenjo-Daro had no memory of the time when those drains were new and perfectly maintained. Each generation normalized its own diminished world and adapted to it, never fully grasping the magnitude of the loss, because the loss had accumulated gradually across lifetimes. This gradual normalization of decline may explain why the Indus Valley people did not undertake the kind of dramatic adaptive measures that might, in theory, have saved their civilization. They did not build massive new reservoirs. They did not dig great canals to redirect the remaining water. They did not reorganize their settlement pattern in a deliberate, coordinated fashion. They simply adjusted, year by year, generation by generation, to a world that was slowly but steadily becoming less hospitable. By the time the decline had become severe enough to be unmistakable, the resources and social cohesion needed for a dramatic response may no longer have existed. The window for action had closed while people were still debating whether there was a problem at all. And this brings us to what may be the most important insight the Indus Valley collapse can offer. The fragility of civilization is not a function of its technological sophistication. The Indus Valley people were among the most skilled engineers and urban planners of the ancient world. Their cities were marvels of design and construction. Their hydraulic systems were unsurpassed. Their craft traditions were among the finest in the Near East, and none of it saved them, because the vulnerability of a civilization lies not in its technology, but in its dependence on specific environmental conditions. The more specialized a civilization becomes, the more efficient its exploitation of a particular set of resources, the more optimized its systems for a particular set of conditions, the more vulnerable it becomes when those conditions change. The Indus Valley civilization was exquisitely adapted to a world of reliable monsoon rainfall and perennial or seasonal rivers flowing through broad floodplains. When that world changed, the very efficiency of their adaptation became a liability. They had built the perfect system for a world that no longer existed. There is a concept in ecology called the adaptive cycle, developed by the Canadian ecologist C.S. Holling in the 1970s and 80s. It describes how complex systems, whether ecological or social, pass through recurring phases. In the first phase, the system exploits available resources and grows. In the second phase, it becomes increasingly efficient, but also increasingly rigid, committed to specific patterns, and increasingly interdependent in its structures. In the third phase, some disturbance, whether fire, drought, disease, invasion, or institutional failure, triggers a rapid unraveling of the system's accumulated structure. In the fourth phase, the remnants of the old system recombine into something new, and the cycle begins again. The Indus Valley civilization fits this model with eerie precision. The exploitation phase was the early Harappan period, when farming communities expanded along the rivers, developed new techniques, and grew in size and complexity. The conservation phase was the mature Harappan period, when the civilization reached its peak of efficiency and interconnection, with standardized bricks and weights, long-distance trade networks, sophisticated urban infrastructure, and a cultural uniformity that spanned a subcontinental area. The release phase was the collapse itself, the 2-century period of decline and abandonment. And the reorganization phase was what came after. The smaller, simpler, more dispersed communities that emerged in the wake of the great city's fall, the communities that would eventually contribute to the cultural complex of early Vedic India. If this interpretation is correct, then the collapse of the Indus Valley was not an anomaly. It was not a freak occurrence, not a one-time catastrophe caused by a unique set of circumstances. It was a phase in a cycle that all complex systems undergo. It was, in a sense, a structural inevitability, not in its specific timing or its specific causes, but in its general form. All complex systems that grow and become increasingly efficient also become increasingly vulnerable to disruption. All complex systems eventually face disruptions that exceed their capacity to absorb. All complex systems eventually release the structure they have accumulated and enter a period of reorganization. The question is not whether a civilization will face its release phase, but when it will face it and how it will navigate the passage. The people of the Indus Valley navigated their release phase by leaving. They abandoned the structures of urban life that could no longer be sustained and reorganized into simpler, more resilient communities that were less dependent on centralized infrastructure, less reliant on long-distance trade, and more directly connected to local food production. It was a loss, an enormous loss of accumulated knowledge, skill, and cultural achievement, but it was also a survival strategy, a strategy that worked. The people survived. Their genes persist in the populations of modern South Asia. Their cultural legacy, though fragmented and transformed beyond recognition, persists in traditions, techniques, and practices that can be traced, however dimly, back to the Harappan era. And in that sense, the abandonment of the great cities was not the end of a people. It was the beginning of a new chapter, albeit one written into smaller, quieter, humbler script than the one that had come before. The Indus Valley people chose, whether consciously or not, survival over grandeur. They chose the future over the past. They chose their children over their monuments. And that choice, painful as it must have been, ensured that they would have descendants to carry the thread of human life forward, even if those descendants would never know the names of the cities their ancestors had built. there is one final aspect of the deeper truth that must be confronted. The Indus Valley collapse forces us to reckon with the idea that progress is not irreversible. We tend to think of history as a rising line, an upward trajectory from simplicity to complexity. The Indus Valley story contradicts this narrative. Here was a society that moved from complexity to simplicity, from urbanization to ruralization, from the use of a writing system to its abandonment. The direction of travel was backward, and it happened not because of any failure of intelligence, but because the environment changed and the old complexity could no longer be sustained. The direction of civilization is not always forward. Sometimes it reverses. Acknowledging this requires a kind of intellectual courage that does not come easily. The Indus Valley people did not have the luxury of that belief. They faced their declining world with whatever tools and wisdom they possessed, and they made the best decisions they could with the information available to them. They were not prophets. They could not see the future. They could not know that the monsoon would continue to weaken, that the Gagar Hakra would never flow again, that their great cities would become mounds of dust visited only by wind and jackals. They knew only what they could see, that the rains were less reliable than they used to be, that the river was lower than it used to be, that the fields were less productive than they used to be. And they responded the only way they could. They moved, they adapted, they survived, and in surviving, they lost everything except their lives. That is the deeper truth. Survival and loss are not opposites, they are companions. The Indus Valley people had both, and the story of their civilization is the story of how survival and loss walked hand in hand across the dusty plains of what had once been a garden, toward an uncertain future that would forget their very names. There is something about standing in the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro, even through the mediation of photographs and descriptions, that provokes a sensation difficult to name. It is not quite sadness. It is not quite awe. It is something closer to recognition, a feeling that what happened there is not safely confined to the past, but is somehow relevant, somehow present, somehow still unfolding in the patterns of our own time. The Indus Valley civilization collapsed because its environment changed in ways that its institutions could not manage. The rivers shifted, the monsoon weakened and became erratic, the agricultural system that sustained millions of people faltered, and the governance structures, whatever form they took, proved unable to coordinate an effective response to the compound crisis. This is not merely an ancient story. Strip away the specific details, the bricks, the seals, the Gaga Hakra, and the underlying structure is contemporary. It is a story about what happens when the environmental assumptions on which a society is built turn out to be wrong. Consider the Indus River today. It remains one of the most important waterways in South Asia, sustaining agriculture for more than 300 million people in Pakistan and northwestern India. But the Indus is under stress. The glaciers in the Karakoram and Himalayan ranges, which feed the river's headwaters, are experiencing significant changes. The monsoon patterns on which South Asian agriculture depends are, according to current scientific assessments, becoming more variable. The same kind of increased volatility that undermined the Harappan civilization 4,000 years ago is, according to multiple climate research groups, beginning to manifest again. The specific mechanisms are different. The technologies available for adaptation are vastly more powerful, but the underlying dynamic, a society built on environmental assumptions that may not hold, is the same. There is a tendency, when confronting stories of ancient collapse, to assume that we are different, that our technology, our science, our global connectivity make us immune to the kinds of failures that brought down the Harappans, the Khmer, the Ancestral Puebloans. And in some respects, this is true. We have tools of prediction and adaptation that the ancient world could not have imagined. We can model climate systems on computers. We can build desalination plants. We can develop crop varieties resistant to drought. We can communicate warnings across the globe in seconds. We can mobilize resources on a scale that no ancient society could have dreamed of. But we also have something the ancients did not: scale and interdependence of a kind that is without precedent in human history. More than 7 billion people depend on interlocking systems of food production, water management, energy supply, transportation, and global trade that are far more complex and far more tightly coupled than anything the Indus Valley civilization ever built. The very interconnectedness that makes modern civilization so productive and so powerful also makes it vulnerable in ways that ancient civilizations were not. A drought in one region can trigger food price spikes that destabilize governments in another hemisphere. A disruption to energy supply can shut down the water treatment plants and refrigeration systems that keep cities habitable. A failure of the global supply chain, as we have seen in recent years, can cascade through every sector of the economy with startling speed. The complexity that sustains us is also the complexity that threatens us. And the more complex the system, the more difficult it is to predict where the next failure point will be. The Indus Valley civilization was, relative to its time, one of the most sophisticated and well-organized societies on Earth. Its engineering was superb, its trade networks were extensive, its urban planning was unmatched, and it still collapsed. Not because its people were foolish or ignorant, not because they lacked skill or knowledge or dedication, but because the environmental conditions on which their entire system depended changed faster than their institutions could adapt. The lesson is not that collapse is inevitable. The lesson is that it is possible, even for the most advanced civilization, when the environment shifts and the institutions fail to respond. We tend to measure civilizations by their monuments, by the size of their pyramids, the height of their cathedrals, the reach of their empires. By this metric, the Indus Valley civilization ranks modestly. It left no pyramids. It left no great tombs filled with gold. It left no monumental inscriptions celebrating the victories of kings. But by another metric, a metric of equity, of public welfare, of the quality of daily life for ordinary people, the Indus Valley may rank among the greatest civilizations ever to exist. A society in which every household, not just the palace, had access to clean water and sanitation. A society in which the streets were planned for the comfort of all residents, not just the convenience of rulers. A society in which the standard of measurement was honest and the standard of construction was uniform. If we judge a civilization not by its monuments to power, but by the well-being of its ordinary citizens, then the Indus Valley civilization was a remarkable achievement, one that we have not yet fully equaled in many parts of the modern world, and this makes its loss all the more poignant. The Indus Valley people built a way of life that was, by ancient standards, humane, and the world lost it, not through malice, not through war, through climate change, and the slow failure of the systems that held it together. The question that this loss poses is whether we can do better, whether we can build civilizations that are not only sophisticated, but also resilient, whether we can create institutions flexible enough to adapt to environmental change, rather than being destroyed by it, whether we can learn from the deep past, from the silent testimony of ruins and bones and empty streets, before it is too late to apply those lessons. There is a philosophical dimension to this that extends beyond practical concerns about policy and infrastructure. The Indus Valley collapse forces us to confront the impermanence of human achievement. We build cities, and without quite articulating it, expect them to be eternal. We construct systems of governance and assume they will persist. We accumulate knowledge and believe it will be preserved. We look at the pyramids and see permanence. We look at our own cities and see stability. But the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro stand as a quiet rebuke to these assumptions. Everything that seems permanent is, in the longest perspective, temporary. Every city is eventually a ruin, or a memory, or a layer of sediment beneath the next city's foundations. Every system of knowledge is eventually forgotten unless extraordinary effort is made to preserve it. Every civilization, no matter how great, eventually passes. This is not a counsel of despair. It is a counsel of humility. The Indus Valley people built something extraordinary, something that deserves to be remembered and honored and studied. Their achievement was real. Their contribution to human history was significant. But their story also deserves to be learned from. The lesson they left behind, written not in words but in bricks and bones and empty streets, is that no civilization is too great to fail, and that the margin between flourishing and collapse can be disturbingly thin. A change in rainfall, a shift in a river's course, a weakening of the systems that maintain order and provide essential services, That is all it takes. Not an earthquake, not an asteroid, not an apocalyptic war, just a slow, quiet change in the conditions that make a particular way of life possible. There is one more aspect of the Indus Valley story that warrants reflection, and it concerns the nature of cultural memory itself. The civilization's disappearance from human awareness for nearly 4,000 years is not just a historical fact. It is a profound statement about the mechanisms by which the past is preserved or lost. The Indus Valley people did not build pyramids that would tower above the landscape for millennia. They did not carve their histories into cliff faces or mountainsides. They built in brick, which crumbles. They wrote on materials that have not survived. The physical traces of their civilization endured only because they were buried beneath layers of river sediment, preserved by the very processes of erosion and deposition that hid them from view. Without that accidental preservation, and without the chance discovery of those buried remains by a deserter from the East India Company in the 1820s, we might never have known that this civilization existed at all. How many other civilizations have been lost in this way? How many great achievements of the human past lie buried beneath deserts, beneath tropical forests, beneath the foundations of modern cities, beneath the waters of rising seas, unknown and unremembered? The Indus Valley was one of the 3 largest civilizations of the ancient world, and it was completely forgotten for 4 millennia. If a society of that scale and sophistication can vanish from human memory, then what else have we lost? What other chapters of the human story have been erased by erosion, by the simple failure of one generation to tell the next what came before? These are not questions with comfortable answers. They are questions that sit with you long after you have heard them. Questions that change the way you look at the world around you. They change the way you look at the cities you live in, at the infrastructure you depend on, at the knowledge you take for granted, at the assumptions you have never questioned. They are the kind of questions that the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro pose to anyone willing to pause long enough to listen. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of the Indus Valley civilization. Not its bricks, though they were beautifully made. Not its drains, though they were engineering marvels. Not its seals, though they are objects of haunting beauty. The greatest legacy is the question the civilization leaves behind. A question that echoes across 4,000 years of silence, that drifts like dust on the wind across the plains of Sind, that settles quietly into the mind of anyone who has ever looked at a ruin and wondered, how much of what we have built will be remembered? And if it is forgotten, will anyone in some distant age stumble upon the remains of our world and wonder who we were and why we left? In the dry plains of Sind, where the wind carries dust from riverbanks that have not felt flowing water in millennia, the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro stand exposed to the sky. The Great Bath, that masterpiece of waterproof engineering, holds no water now. Its carefully sealed bricks are cracking. The bitumen lining that once kept the pool watertight is visible in places, a dark residue from an age when water was abundant and civic life was organized around the rituals and rhythms of cleanliness. The drainage channels that once carried wastewater beneath clean streets are choked with earth, their precision geometry distorted by centuries of subsidence and silting. The wells that once served neighborhoods of bustling families descend into darkness and silence. The bricks, those precisely standardized bricks that were once the building blocks of a continent-spanning civilization, are slowly crumbling under the assault of salt crystallization rising from the water table, wind erosion, and the occasional floods that still sweep across the Indus Plain during the monsoon season. These ruins do not shout, they whisper, they do not demand attention. They simply endure, quietly, patiently, as they have endured for more than 4,000 years, waiting for someone to ask the right questions, waiting for someone to understand what they represent. Not just the remains of buildings, but the remains of a way of thinking, a way of organizing human life, a way of relating to water and land and community that was lost so completely that it had to be rediscovered by accident. The Indus Valley civilization was not destroyed by enemies. It was not burned by conquerors. It was not swallowed by a sudden catastrophe. It was undone by the slow, patient, relentless forces of environmental change. Rivers that shifted course over centuries, rains that became unreliable over generations, landscapes that dried and cracked and refused to yield the harvests they had once provided in abundance. The people who had built one of the greatest civilizations the ancient world had ever seen looked at the world around them and recognized, perhaps slowly, perhaps reluctantly, perhaps with a grief we cannot imagine, that it was no longer the world they had built for. And so they left. They left their cities. They left their baths and their drainage systems and their carefully planned streets. They left their weights and measures, their workshops and their granaries. They left the seals with their undeciphered script, those small, square objects that once served some purpose we cannot now recover, some function in a system of commerce or governance or belief that died with the last person who understood it. They left it all behind and walked east, walked south, walked into a future that would remember nothing of what they had been. The forgetting is perhaps the cruelest part of the entire story. Civilization's end. This is a truth as old as civilization itself. Cities are built and cities are abandoned. Empires rise and empires fall. But the Indus Valley was not merely ended. It was erased. For nearly 4,000 years, it existed only as mounds of earth, in a landscape that gave no hint of what lay beneath. No epic poem preserved its memory. No religious text invoked its name. No neighboring civilization recorded the manner of its passing. It vanished so completely that, when its ruins were finally uncovered in the 20th century, the discoverers had no framework for understanding what they had found. They had to invent one. They had to create, from scratch, an entire scholarly apparatus for studying a world that history had simply failed to record. There is a grief in that. A grief that goes beyond the academic, beyond the scholarly, into something more personal and more human, because every one of those standardized bricks was made by human hands. Every one of those drainage channels was dug by someone who believed it mattered, someone who took pride in the slope of the grade and the fit of the bricks. Every bead carved in a Harappan workshop was shaped by fingers that belonged to a person with a name, a family, a daily routine, a favorite food, a memory of childhood, a hope for the future. And all of those names, all of those families, all of those daily lives, all of those small and precious human moments are gone. Not destroyed, not erased by violence, simply unremembered, passed over by the relentless current of time. The Indus Valley civilization reminds us that memory is not automatic. It is not guaranteed by the scale of an achievement, or the quality of a construction, or the number of lives it touched. Memory requires effort. It requires transmission. It requires someone in every generation to carry the story forward, to tell the children what their grandparents knew, to write down what might otherwise be forgotten, to value the past enough to preserve it. When the last people left the cities of the Indus Valley, they carried with them the knowledge of how to build, how to plan, how to manage water and measure goods. But within a few generations, that knowledge was no longer needed, and so it was no longer passed on. And once the chain of transmission broke, the knowledge was gone. Not temporarily misplaced, not stored in a vault to be recovered later. Gone. Irretrievably and permanently gone. We live in an age of information abundance. We record everything. We photograph everything. We store everything on servers and in databases and in the vast digital archives of the modern world. And yet the lesson of the Indus Valley suggests that preservation is not merely a matter of technology. It is a matter of attention. It is a matter of care. It is, ultimately, a matter of choosing to remember. Knowledge survives only when someone needs it, values it, and makes the deliberate effort to pass it on. When the context that gives knowledge its meaning disappears, the knowledge itself follows, no matter how sophisticated the recording technology. The Indus Valley people were not primitive. They were not backward. They were not less intelligent or less capable than we are. They were among the most skilled, most organized, most innovative people of the ancient world. They solved problems of urban sanitation that would not be solved again for 2,000 years. They created a system of standardized measurement that unified an area larger than most modern nations. They built cities that were, by any reasonable standard, among the most livable and well-planned on Earth in their era. They traded with civilizations thousands of kilometers away. They produced art of exceptional beauty and craft work of extraordinary precision. And yet it was not enough. The rivers shifted, the rains changed. The world they had built for ceased to be the world they lived in, and all their skill, all their knowledge, all their centuries of accumulated wisdom could not save what they had built. They could save themselves. And perhaps that is what matters most. Perhaps, in the end, the measure of a civilization is not whether its buildings endure, but whether its people survive. By that measure, the Indus Valley civilization did not fail. It transformed. It dispersed. It became something else, something smaller and simpler, but still alive, still human, still carrying within it the biological and cultural legacy of all that had come before. There is a mound of earth in the Sind desert where a city once stood, a city of tens of thousands of souls, with running water and covered drains, and a great public bath at its center. The people who built it did not know that their city would one day lie buried and forgotten beneath layers of dust and silence. They did not know that the river that sustained them would one day run dry. They did not know that the rains would falter, that the fields would crack, that the granaries would empty, that the centuries of accumulated knowledge they carried in their hands and heads would dissolve within a few generations of their departure. They built for permanence. They achieved something close to it. 700 years is a long time, longer than most civilizations endure. And then the world changed, as the world always does, and permanence proved to be an illusion. The wind moves across the plains of Sind. It carries dust from the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro, particles of ancient brick worn smooth by 4,000 years of exposure, particles that were once part of walls and floors, and drains that served a living city of living people. That dust settles on fields and roads and riverbanks, becoming part of the landscape, becoming invisible, becoming nothing more than soil. And somewhere beneath the earth, the great bath endures, empty, silent, its bitumen seal still intact in places, still holding back water that will never come, waiting, as it has waited for 4,000 years, for the return of a world that has moved on without it. The story of the Indus Valley is, in the end, a story about us, about all of us, about every human being who has ever built something and hoped it would last, about every community that has ever organized itself around a river or a harvest or a shared set of rules, about every generation that has ever inherited the work of its ancestors and tried to carry it forward. The Indus Valley people were not different from us in any way that matters. They loved their children. They took pride in their work. They planned for the future. They assumed the world they knew would continue. And they were wrong. But they were not defeated. They walked away from their cities, but they did not walk away from each other. They carried their humanity with them into whatever came next. And that humanity, passed from parent to child across 400 generations, is still here, still building, still planning, still hoping, still vulnerable, still capable of forgetting, and still, if we choose, capable of remembering. The ruins of Mohenjo-Daro ask nothing of us. They make no demands. They issue no warnings in words we can read. They simply stand, or crumble, in the dry wind of Sind, a testament to what was built and what was lost and what endures despite everything. The bricks are falling. The drains are clogged. The script is silent. But the question remains, as clear and as pressing as it was the day the last family closed the door of their home for the final time and turned their faces toward the east. The question is not whether civilizations fall. They do. The question is what we choose to remember and what we choose to build next.